Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking with Luís Ribeiro about the life and work of astrologer Helena Avelar. Hey, Luís, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be here, Chris.
Yeah, we've been meaning to do this episode for a few months now to talk about your partner, Helena, who passed away unexpectedly earlier this year on March 9th, and who you had collaborated with for a few decades now in your work on astrology. And she actually had a book that came out, which was the published version of her PhD dissertation that came out just a few months ago, as well as a paper that actually just came out a few days ago. So we were going to do, in this discussion, kind of an overview of her life, and then in the second part, discuss her work, and especially her book that just came out, which is titled An Astrologer at Work in Late Medieval France, The Notebooks of Belle. How are you doing, just first off?
Okay, I'm okay. I'm doing fine.
Yeah. So you've continued a lot of the work that you guys were doing since that time?
Yeah. I assumed the teaching of our school and some of the projects that we had together, some of the academic projects. So these works that we're going to discuss today were the last ones where Lena, that she wrote directly, and now for in the future there will still be a few works that we were doing together, which I'll finish at some point.
Okay.
Yeah.
So previously, the two of you had done an episode with me on the podcast, actually, that was released almost two years ago exactly, which was episode 225, titled Helena Avelar and Luís Ribeiro on Traditional Astrology. So people can go back and listen to that for some of our previous discussion, where we talked more about your thoughts on traditional astrology. But here I thought it would be good to give more of a chronology of Helena's life from you, since you knew her the best out of anybody, and can maybe provide some more insight into just the significance of her contributions to astrology and how she grew and developed as an astrologer during the course of her life.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, Helena always have had an interest for astrology, which came from mythology. She would always tell this tale that her grandfather used to read her bedtime stories with the ancient Greek myths, of course, tailored for a child, of course, without the more adult bits. But she grew on that. And so when at some point she started to be interested in astrology, that was there, that interest on the myths and on the stars and on the meanings of the constellations. That was always there. So she had an interest in astronomy as well, observing the sky. She liked that a lot. And from there, the interest grew. She then she was a reporter, a journalist for some years. And at some point, she decided to start studying astrology. And she tried to seek out, first, I think she got a consultation, which was not that good.
Right. I think she said she had some familiarity with sun sign astrology in her teen years as a teenager, but I was watching an interview with her that actually goes into her life quite a bit, that was published in November of 2020, just last year, by Volker Schendel on his YouTube channel. It was titled Dr. Helena Avelar, Astro Project Traditional Astrology, and she said she had some basic exposure to sun sign, but she had this sense that there must be more to this, or that there must be something else there. And eventually she did discover real astrology and birth charts.
Yeah, exactly. And then she found a school here in she got final, I think, after one unsuccessful attempt at having a proper reading, she found then a proper astrologer to give her a reading, and then she wanted to study, and he advised her the school that existed in Portugal many years ago, which was basically the school where many of today's practitioners here in Portugal studied, and that's where we met. Yeah.
That's kind of interesting that her first reading actually wasn't very good. And it's kind of funny because I think you hear that sometimes from different astrologers where, on the one hand, it's really good to get consultations from other astrologers to see how other astrologers practice, maybe especially early in your studies. But on the other hand, sometimes the experience is not always necessarily, because you don't know who you're having a consultation with. And if you're new to astrology, you don't usually have the skills to figure out who's like a very good or well-respected astrologer versus who isn't. So sometimes people do get a bad reading, and most of the rest of their astrological career partially becomes, learning how to do a better job than that person did in some sense.
Exactly. Well, she caught something that we had and still have to some extent in Portugal. Back then, it was very common, is that people who call themselves astrologers were not exactly astrologers. They were, tarot readers, psychics, whatever, and sometimes not good at all. And that's what she got. So he didn't even, I don't think he even made her a proper chart. He just read a few things about her sun sign, and that's it. So it was really, really, really bad one.
But she was getting into real astrology at this point and wanted to learn more. And what time frame was this? This is in like the 1980s when she's in her 20s or 30s?
Probably later. I don't know. I know that she had already studied by then. I'm now recalling, because the timeline is a bit blurred. But she had already studied, and she had started with a book that was published long time ago by a friend of ours, under a pseudonym at the time, which was an introduction to astrology. That was basically the book that everyone here in Portugal started with, because it had the tables to calculate charts. It had all the basic instructions for interpretation. So she started there and she calculated her own chart. She did all the work. I think it was a little bit off. And so she wasn't sure exactly of the ascendant back then, because the tables were approximations. This was not a huge book, so it didn't have all the dates. But she started there, and then I think at some point, if I remember correctly, she then sought out an astrologer to really understand what she was doing. The first attempt didn't work very well, but at the second try, she found a proper astrologer who then led her to a school. And that's where she started to train, and to organize her knowledge as an astrologer. Yeah.
It's interesting that this was during a period, because she was born in the mid-1960s, and so the period we're talking about when she really starts getting into astrology would have been at least like the 1980s, and certainly by the 1990s. So it's a little bit before the rise of the personal computer, and certainly before the advent of the internet, where you can, everybody nowadays can easily just go to various websites and get their chart calculated in 5 seconds. But this is in a stage where you needed to calculate your chart by hand using, tables and books and other things like that if you really wanted to practice astrology.
Yeah, exactly. She, as a journalist, for example, she still used a typewriter, and it was during her period as a journalist that the first word processors started to show up, and then the computers. So she witnessed all of that. But at that time, you would calculate it by hand. There was no other way. There weren't personal computers, as we were saying, so you couldn't really do much. And the problem sometimes is that you didn't have the tables of conversion of time zones. You didn't have the daylight savings. So, and people sometimes make huge mistakes, 1 hour, 2 hours off of their proper chart because they didn't have the correct tables, or they didn't have the information to apply them. And I'm thinking of someone who's just starting with no instructions, with no teacher who can orient them, and people just experimented. Yeah. And she went through that, yeah. And myself at the beginning, yeah.
So maybe some of that background as a journalist helped her in terms of being able to investigate for herself, or at least look up and find resources for some of these things. Because I can see in like her later career as an academic that she, has an ability to research sources and to look things up that's really necessary for that kind of investigative work. But I can imagine already early on in her 20s or 30s that would have come in handy as she's trying to get into the field of astrology and figure out, where to go and how to learn the subject.
Yeah, and she was she had a very good sense of discernment. So she knew when things were working out and she was learning something which was significant that she didn't know, or when there wasn't really good quality in the sources or the people teaching. So she had quite a good way of recognizing that and really doing that separation. Yeah.
Okay. So eventually she found a school. And what was this school that she learned at? And that's the point at which you crossed paths with her as well?
Yeah, this was the Chiron School of Astrology. It was one of two only schools at this time. There were these two official schools, let's say, if official is the correct word, but larger, let's say. And then other than that, there was private tutors. There were teachers who had small groups, but those were less known. Almost everyone would go through this school at some point or another, and it was there that we both had our first training on astrology.
And this was in the early 1990s?
Yeah. I went in, let me think, sometime around 96, 95, something around those dates. And she was more or less at the same time. We were not in the same year of the school, because the school had at least 3 or 4 years, I don't recall, of teaching, but we were not in the same year exactly, but we were very close, yeah. So this would be mid to late 90s.
And how long had you been studying astrology at that point yourself?
When we started, I started almost from scratch. I had 1 year of independent study, reading books and trying to understand how it worked before I went to a school that was recommended at the time. Yeah.
Okay. And you're a little younger than she is. You're about roughly a decade younger?
A decade, no, 10 years, yeah. Yeah, roughly, almost a decade, yeah.
Got it. Okay. And the Chiron school, so that's more, and I can sort of hear just by the name, is more of a, would you say like a modern astrology or sort of new age influence school? Or because when I think of astrology in the mid 1990s and what it was like from English speaking sources when I started in 1999, 2000, it was more psychological and character based and Jungian, and also with many sources a very strong new age focus. Was it the same with this school or in Portugal at the time?
Yeah. This was the school, as most of astrology in Portugal back then, had strong French influences. So you had karmic astrology, you had all the new age stuff, the psychology, of course, the Rudyard, all of that was included there. But this was a more, let's say, more towards the new age. It depended on the teacher, because there were several teachers, but most of them went inclined toward the new age movement. So it was modern astrology, certainly. With all the works, we began as studying astrology, so modern astrology. Yeah.
Okay. And you two connected, and did you hit it off right away, or did you start talking or studying together, or what was your connection at that point when you both met at this school?
Well, Helena came and talked to me at some point because I was drawing. I used to draw in a lot of diagrams and stuff in my notebooks.
Because you're an illustrator. That's one of your skills is illustrating.
Exactly. So I was drawing something, and she came and asked me how I was doing it. And then we talked, and then there were a lot of months, and I didn't cross paths with her because we were in different time schedules at the time. And then I crossed paths with her outside the school at least twice, if I recall correctly, and we said hi, hello. And then at some point where we had already, at least I had already finished my studies of astrology, and I was sort of starting to go independent and on my own, starting my first readings and all of that. There was this mutual friend who wanted to open a center also that could have courses, workshops, and she invited me and mentioned that Helena would be there. And at the time, I didn't knew Helena that much, so the name didn't ring a bell. And she told me, oh, she knows you. And I said, okay, perhaps I know her, but then I don't know the name. And then when we met, there it was, Helena. And since then, so this was 98. Since then, we were talking, and when we started to be closer and closer until we decided to get together. And, well, right after, at the beginning of 99.
Okay. Yeah. So that was, over 20 years ago at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. It was 21 years last year. So, yeah.
Right. So you're both doing modern astrology and practicing. Are you both starting to see clients at this point?
Yes. By 99, I was already teaching astrology. I had a small study group, and then Helena came in as well, and we started what would become the academy at this point, our school, and it began in 99, and we began to teach together modern astrology, of course, but we had already some books and the notion of traditional astrology because differently from the English-speaking countries, we had access to books from Spain that were translated in the 50s, in the 60s, and the 70s. So a little bit earlier than the translation wave that happened in England and the United States. So there were, the Arabic authors, Ezra, were circulating, and Ali ibn Rajal were already circulating by then, and we had access to them. Helena had some, and then a friend of ours also showed us, who was also an astrologer, showed us these books, and we acquired them and started studying from them.
Were these translated? Were these in Spanish, or were they translated into Portuguese?
Spanish.
Okay, so both of you could read Spanish.
Yeah, it's similar enough to Portuguese so we can understand it quite well.
So, and there had been works translated into Spanish from traditional astrological texts, and Al-Rijal is like one of the largest. Like, he has a huge compendium, which is a very massive text from the medieval period on different branches of astrology.
Yeah. Ali ibn Rajal has perhaps one of the most successful books of astrology in Europe. So, although we do have a Masahala and Abu Mashar and all the other Arabs, the complete set of areas of astrology were coming from Ali ibn Rajal, and these is, I believe, the main link of transmission of many of the techniques that we see in the Arabs, especially in Abu Mashar, coming to the Latin world. And this book is translated first into Spanish directly, into Old Castilian, and then later from Old Castilian into Latin. So the version we had was a modern edition of the Old Castilian version that was circulating at the time. So that's where we started to learn a little bit, but only when we started to learn with Robert Soler And this was 2001, 2002. I don't recall exactly the year, but it was sometimes around 2002 that we had a more structured approach to tradition through his introductory course and then through his diploma.
Right, because if you had access to some of those translations, but sometimes if you don't have any training in traditional astrology, it can be very hard as a modern astrologer to just pick up a translation of a traditional text from, in this case, Al Regil is from the 11th century, and it's been translated through a few languages before, you're reading it in the version that you're reading, and it can be very hard to fully grasp as much of the information as you might if you had like an introduction to traditional first.
Yeah. It's like all. I think the same is out for any Hellenistic or medieval sources. They're not usually, with a few exceptions, they're not easily to start with that. You need a little bit of basics to start to extract proper information from those sources. It's only later in the early modern period, and the most well known is Willie because it's in English, that you already had a more didactical approach to the topic. Because in the older sources, older than early modern period, it's not built for our minds. We no longer think and structure knowledge that way, so it's more difficult to enter it. Yeah.
Sure. So the two of you came across the work of Robert Zoller by 2001 or so, or by 2001?
Yeah, I think it was when early in the beginning of the new library initiative, I think, where he was involved. Sue Ward was involved at the beginning. And that's how we met them both.
Through Zoller initially partnered up with somebody that was going to start offering his courses online, which was probably kind of a very innovative thing at that point, circa 2001, before online learning and online teaching had really taken off. So you came across his work because it started being promoted as where you could study through online and through like a correspondence course with him.
Yeah, exactly. And later we came in contact. We took the course and we came in contact with him and Sue Ward through someone we knew that had an astrological journal. So she had made the contact, and then through her we got also the contacts, and we did the course with Robert, and then Sue Ward was here as well teaching. They both came to Lisbon to teach. We organized some workshops for them. At the time, we also organized the first astrological meeting, congress in Portugal ever done. First with Portuguese speakers, and in the second edition, this was 2001, and then in 2002 we already had foreign participants. I think Sue came to the 2002 Congress, and then we still made one in 2003, and that was our last. I think I'm recalling the dates correctly. I think 2003 was our last attempt at the Congress, and then by 2004, Helena had entered at the university, and we had other interests to attend to. Yeah.
Right. So you started going through a transformation at this point in terms of your practice of astrology and your focus. And maybe if we could expand on that point a little bit, because, probably like traditional astrology has become so normalized these days that it probably seems like less of a big deal, or will, as time goes on further and further. But I think starting to study with Robert Zoller in particular, Zoller had been studying traditional astrology since the 70s or 80s. And he was one of the first English-speaking astrologers that really went back and tried to revive some of the older methods of especially medieval astrology through the work of Guido Bonatti and other astrologers. So he took a much more, hardline sort of traditionalist approach where he would say like the old ways are the good ways. And he had developed one of the first courses where it was kind of like a comprehensive course on how to do astrology according to the older medieval methods. What was that like for the two of you as modern astrologers to start studying traditional astrology together?
Well, I remember it being very, very exciting because we had all these components that we had already heard about in our source books, but didn't know exactly how to work them out. And suddenly we had a system. And I think what struck us immediately was the way that the traditional astrology organized knowledge and information and really taught you how to extract information from a chart, how to do a proper interpretation. And I think that was what hooked us on immediately, because we were at the time, and I think people nowadays don't realize this as much, at that point, astrology had become something very nebulous, because you had all these symbolic, archetypical, psychological approaches that almost didn't need a chart to do their things. So astrology was kind of dissociated from itself. And what most people called astrology involved very little astrology. And then this new wave of traditional astrology kind of grounded this into proper knowledge. And we loved that immediately, when we still do. And we dedicated then to study and recovering all that tradition and working it out properly and really understanding how to think in terms of astrology. Because I think, and I know many people don't agree with this, but I think most of modern astrology makes it up as it goes, It relies too much in symbolic associations. And I have nothing against symbolic associations or mythology or archetypes or whatever. All of that is very interesting knowledge. But it starts to fill itself with it and forgets about astrology. You see, when people delineate planets or talk about the symbolism of a planet, they get overexcited about the symbol. They fly directly into the symbolic, and then astrology is lost in the way because you're talking about the symbol and you're not talking about the planet astrologically speaking. And I think that's a sin that's still around very much. And traditional astrology makes you go back to the real. In the sense, what Zoller said, the old days are the good way. So it comes back to reality. Okay, all of that is very pretty, but how does this work exactly?
Sure. Just in terms of being able to ground it in being able to make statements about concrete events that will or will not happen in a person's life.
Yes. Even if you're just talking about psychological behavior, you can do a psychological analysis with traditional astrology. And it's it has wonderful tools to do that. I think much more in depth than any other system of astrology that's out there. But because it's more concrete, so you're talking about things that the person can immediately identify. It's not just generic things that can be applied to a greater number of people. They're very specific. And that's the charm that traditional astrology enveloped us in, and we haven't left it since. Yeah.
Right, for over 20 years now. So you would have learned natal astrology then primarily from Zoller, and then you also started studying with Sue Ward at this point, who specializes in horary astrology and especially in the work of William Lilly from the 17th century, which is one of the earliest English-speaking astrologers, or at least that wrote the first major textbook on astrology in English in the mid-17th century. So you started studying horary with her?
Yeah. Helena dedicated herself more to horary, and I to natal with Zoller, so we kind of split there a little bit at some time, but we were both learning at the same time. Yeah. And then we started to expand also. So we didn't stay there. We had sources, so we started to expand our knowledge of traditional astrology. And one thing that we did was, once we had the structure and the backbone to rely on, we started to go to as much sources as we could. And at that time, there weren't that many available. So anything that we could read on Project Hindsight, these Spanish translations, and all of that were quite helpful and gave us a broad range view of astrology from, let's say, the Greek speaking world to the later early modern, going through to that core of the medieval period. And that allows us to reconstruct, and give more substance to that core of astrological doctrine and practice that is incredibly valuable to work and to extract really real information from charts.
Right. And through some of those Spanish translations and sources like Al Rigel, you would have had access to something that was unique that most of the just purely English-speaking world of traditional astrologers didn't have access to, because even though Ben Dykes eventually started translating some works from Al Rigel, that was like 10 or 15 years later, but this is a source that you two had been working with since the early 2000s?
Yeah. And one of the things that Ali Ben Rajal has that you couldn't find, and only recently it came up, was the techniques of prognostication. How to work the Ferdaria, how to work the perfections, the solar returns, and how to combine them all. So we learned that early on by studying Rijal's work, which is not easy, I must say, because he has a very convoluted medieval way of explaining things. So you really need to read those passages 10 times until you can extract exactly what he means. And we learned a lot from that. So things that came out recently with Dykes Abu Masar's translation of the predictive work, we already knew to Ali Ben Rajal, because Ali Ben Rajal, I think it's sourcing most of his material on Abu Masar and expanding a little bit more into its own ideas and opinions. So we had access to that very early on.
Okay, nice.
That was valuable.
Yeah, that's super important and put you ahead and still ahead, which we'll get to in terms of why the two of you became leaders in the field of traditional astrology and became very influential around the world with some of your later publications once you actually started writing books on the topic. So something happened, though, around that point where it seemed like the early phases of you two got swept up a little bit in a trend that I noticed started in the 1990s with astrologers and continued into the 2000s, where some astrologers decided to go back to school in order to get advanced degrees and training studying the history of astrology. And I know for some of the astrologers in like the mid 90s, some of their motivation was to make astrology more respectable and to make inroads in academia for different reasons. Like there was things going on with Kepler College or different things like that. And there's a whole list of astrologers that went back to school. When did that process start happening for you, and how aware of you were you that other astrologers were doing that, and what were your motivations?
Well, we knew that things were coming up. You had the Bath Spa already in place. But
so that was Nick Campion's program?
Nick Campion's program was already working, Kepler College as well. But those were a bit inaccessible to us at the time. But what happened really, and focusing on Helena, is that at one point I had been in university until 99 to early 2000. And I took chemistry, which I didn't appreciate that much, and then I went into geology.
Right, because you're only in your like mid 20s at that point, right? Because you're born in 74.
Yeah.
Ish. Okay, so 94 is 20. 1999, you're 25.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then I stopped and dedicated myself to astrology. I met Helena, so that's more or less coincidental in time. But at some point, Helena, who only she had done all her high school, and then she had went to a technical. She started working in the journalism, and she had some technical course at some point. I don't recall already exactly the details. And she wanted that sometimes she wanted to go to university.
Yeah, I'd read it was like 2004 is when she went back to get her bachelor's degree.
Exactly. And she went through all the exams, all the admission exams, and she selected history. She decided to go to history because it was a topic that she loved. And she did her whole bachelor's degree. But at her time, she wasn't thinking of academic career. She just wanted to complete her university studies. She wanted to have the university studies, have her degree, go through that process. And that was it. So we weren't at the time thinking of reaching where we are right now, where we are really researching at high level in academia. The idea for her initially was to make the course. And at the time she asked me if I wanted to go back to study again. And I said, well, not yet. Not yet. At some point in the future, maybe, but not yet. And so she completed her degree.
And the way it works with the bachelor's degree, she was able to focus entirely on history for her bachelor's somehow, or I was watching the interview with the German astrologer, and she seemed to say she could focus just on that without doing a lot of other focus on like science or math or other things like that. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So it's almost like a master's degree, her bachelor's at that point in some way.
Yeah. It's history. So it's a general history. She then in the MA she specialized in medieval history. That was one of her options. She had two. She loved two periods: Assyria, so antiquity, and medieval. And at the time, the branch, so that the MA for the Assyrian period didn't open that year, and she decided on medieval. Or else she would have done a work on some cuneiform tables or something like that.
Wow, that's a really interesting split there then, where she could have gone either way or one of two ways.
Yeah, she loved languages. She knew a little bit of Egyptian. She studied a little bit of hieroglyphs. She studied a little bit of Assyrian. She knew a little Hebrew. She knew Arab a little bit again. So she was very gifted for languages, and she studied a lot. And she already had a knowledge. She could read Greek very well, although she didn't speak the language fluently, but she could read and she could understand a lot. So perhaps not enough to translate, but she could understand it. And so she had that interest.
That's a major asset as a historian and also as an astrologer, being able to have that sort of facility with languages and to speak or at least be able to read so many different languages.
Yeah, it is. It is something that it helps a lot. It helps a lot. Sometimes even having, multiple ability to read multiple modern languages, because then you can access, books in Spanish, French, German, Italian, that otherwise you aren't able to read. And that is good. And of course, ancient languages is wonderful if you can. Yeah. And she had that gift. She didn't develop it too much, or as much as she would like. So she took her BA in history. She finished in 4 years. At the time, it was 4 years to finish. Now there are 3. They shifted when she was in mid completing the degree, and there was this reformation on the education system. So she got that. She did it in 4 years, and then she decided to attempt the MA, which was a big jump because she wasn't. That was not in her plans at first. Yeah.
What changed, or what at some point in that 4-year period she gets really dedicated to history and decides to make this a much more serious commitment and long-term project if she decided to get her master's degree in history as well.
Yeah, she decided that she could study, and that was the point where she understood that she could go and use, now that she had done the basic training of her BA, she could do an MA on the history of astrology. And this was an important key point where she got the idea, okay, now I can do something interesting regarding astrology, and develop and contribute something with the history of astrology. Because at this time, since early 2000, we had been researching, on the libraries and on archives, whatever existed of astrological material. And by 2002, we already had a copy of the manuscript that she would be studying on her PhD. We already knew about it, and by reading, history books and history research here in Portugal, where they mentioned astrology, and that clicked. Once she had the course done, that clicked, and she said, "I'm going to do something also on astrology." And I remember she asking me, "Do you think that's possible?" I think, "Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea." And there she went, and she did her master's.
That's amazing that you have, so in Portugal, there are still many libraries that contain manuscripts from the Renaissance and from the medieval periods and sometimes older. And so the two of you since 2000 had been going in and starting to familiarize yourself with these manuscripts and with what books that survived and trying to read them and start working with them, and also probably learning some of the skills that are necessary in order to read those older source texts.
Yeah. So as we were structuring our learning of traditional astrology, we were also, accessing and seeing these sources, these direct sources in Portuguese. And that was quite valuable as well to our practice, because then it's not only theories in books, you can also see practice.
Right. And I find that's a really interesting thing, that the astrological motivation for astrologers becomes like an underlying driving force and a reason to learn ancient languages or to learn paleography, like how to read ancient manuscripts and handwriting in manuscripts and different skills like that. So the two of you must have had a really good reason then to have the practice of astrology to actually learn all these skills.
Yeah. Well, it was was the main drive, to go into academia. And Helena had been searching for sources for some time, and when she decided to do the MA, she was quite a pioneer here in Portugal. So her MA, which was completed in 2011, was the first academic work on the history of astrology in Portugal. People had talked about it, and there are a few papers mentioning it briefly, but hers is the first official, let's say, proper history of astrology MA in Portugal. So she did the first work, and she did it already in English, and that was fortunate, because that opened, her research to the wider world. Because if she had written in Portuguese, as it was usually at the time, they wouldn't encourage people to write in English. It was still, nowadays it's normal, but at the time it wasn't still the current practice. And she insisted, and I think she did well, because then she made known what materials we had in Portugal, and by studying something that there aren't many studies on it, which is the chronicles. How the chronicles that put the king and the nobleman, in high praising, and give all the narrative of their glorious life and effects, is supported by astrological arguments.
Right. So her master's degree was on astrology in the Portuguese royal court.
Yeah, exactly.
And what did that consist of, or what time period what was the scope of it?
That is late 14, but mainly 15th century. So late medieval, because that's where we have the chronicles coming in. It's our second dynasty. And by then you have astrological narratives in the court. They connect eclipses to the winning of wars. They connect certain planetary positions to the great abilities of rulership of the kings, and so on. And you have enormous quantity of this narrative in the chronicles that had been ignored since, people knew it existed, but it was put aside and disconsidered as, nonsense of the time, as they sometimes say. And she proved that that was a very important part of the narrative.
Right. So she was part of one of the early groups of people that were going back and looking at astrology as a legitimate historical subject to study in history because of the influence that it had on society and culture and science and philosophy and all these other things. But there hadn't been a lot of work done necessarily, especially on this specific area in Portugal yet.
No, nothing. In Portugal, there was almost nothing. And as we say today, to understand the Middle Ages, that was her focal point, or even the early modern period or ancient classical world, without the element of astrology, it's doing the puzzle with a big chunk of it missing, because that is part of their cosmological narrative, the way they see the world. And to ignore that because it's the superstitious nonsense of the past, as older historiography used to do, it's absurd. It's completely absurd. It's like doing the history of Europe and ignoring religion, Catholic religion. It wouldn't make sense. But the same with astrology, and you still have a very sort of strong resistance in academia still today in seeing that, from older historians. I think they're very resistant to it.
Right. It's tricky because it's still a popular thing that exists in culture and that people talk about in terms of pop astrology, and it has current cultural meaning and relevance, but not typically in a good way, especially from an academic context or a scientific context for that matter, where it's usually seen as superstition and something that's looked down upon. And therefore, in a historical context, even though it's playing such a big role in history, it's something where up until recently, and still to a certain extent now, historians, look down on it still even historically and don't necessarily want to treat that as a serious subject to dedicating their lives to studying.
Yeah. It's one of the wretched sciences, as they call it. It is knowledge that was expelled, extracted from science and from, what is considered today high knowledge. Thus, if it doesn't make sense today, you're not going to study in the past. Why are you studying that? Which is absolute nonsense. Helena used to say that it's easier to talk about the history of cannibalism, which is a very shocking topic whenever we speak of it. It's easier than to talk about the history of astrology. Because if you are talking about the cannibalistic practices of, the 3rd century before Christ, somewhere, no one is assuming that you might believe that and do it yourself. If you talk about astrology, even if you're not a practitioner of astrology and you have no interest in practicing, you're just studying as a subject, people will assume that you're giving it credit.
Right.
So it's very strange. And she would say this, and she had a good perception of this, astrology is a subject towards which academia and science, modern science, has a very strong emotional reaction. When you try to discuss astrology, the reaction is not a logical, cold, logical one. It's an emotional reaction against it. So it's a bit odd.
Right. Where even famous academics that have done a lot of really respectable work sometimes have been put in the position of having to defend studying astrology in a historical context. You mentioned it as a quote unquote a wretched subject, which is, referring to a famous paper or article in 1951 from Otto Neugebauer titled "The Study of Wretched Subjects," where he had to respond to this other historian that kind of complained that people were doing historical work on the history of astrology.
Yeah, Saturn, George Saturn, which is one of the monoliths of the history of science. And Neugebauer goes against him. It's quite an interesting... It's one of the most famous papers in the history of astrology and mathematics, perhaps, but history of astrology. And it's only one page length,
Right. It's very concise, but it's also very pointed and very powerful. And it's set kind of almost like a standard, it seemed like, for later historians to be able to defend the study of this subject as a legitimate subject for history because of the influence that astrology exerted over all other areas of society and culture and history.
Yeah, exactly. And now that we're talking about this, this reminds me that one of also the motivators for our start studying astrology in academia was a 2004 conference in Amsterdam of horoscopes and history, which Zoller attended, and a lot of the major names still in current history of astrology, which I attended. Helena, at the time, we decided one of us will go, and I was the one who had the chance of going there, and it was very interesting. And it was a very interesting moment to see it apply to historical examples. And it was a wonderful conference. I loved it. And when Helena, at the end of that year, decided to do her MA, I suggested her to contact one of the organizers, Koku von Stuckrad, to be her co-supervisor, because when she proposed this topic, the first reaction was a bit negative. Her supervisor to be was a bit apprehensive with the topic, didn't know what to do with it. She wasn't a specialist at all on it. There weren't any here in Portugal. And what she said to Helena is, okay, please bring me sources. Bring me a layout, your plan, what sources you're going to use. And Helena did the homework, and she had already a lot of things aligned. And she went there, and she said to her, okay, I'm convinced. I think you have enough material to go through. And she herself says this and tells this story, how Helena changed her perspective on the topic. And then she got her as a supervisor. And then Koku von Stuckrad was her co-supervisor. And he's not exactly an historian of astrology, but he has dealt with, in the context of history of religion, he has dealt with astrology enough to know exactly how to, evaluate someone's work in that field. So he was a good asset also to her work, as a supervisor.
So that's a really major turning point then, that conference, the Horoscopes and History conference that happened in 2004. And I guess that makes a lot of sense because that was a big deal, because it was probably one of the first times a conference had been put together like that, where a group of different international scholars on the history of astrology got together to present papers on the topic. And that one was interesting because I heard about it, and Dimitra George attended it, and she invited me to go. I was only like a year into my Kepler studies though and couldn't attend, but it had this amazing lineup of scholars, and they also invited two astrologers who also had a background in the history of astrology, which is Robert Zoller and James Holden. they did end up publishing a collection of papers afterwards. I think it came out in 2005 from that conference, which was titled Horoscopes and Public Spheres. But they didn't end up publishing Holden's paper or Zoller's paper. But it was at least an interesting crossing point between work on the history of astrology and also a little bit of involvement from astrologers.
Yeah. It was a key point. No, there's a whole lot of little stories surrounding that conference.
Anything you can, because I've heard a little bit, because I heard from like Zoller's perspective that his talk didn't go well when I spent like a year living with him few years later when he was at Project Hindsight. But I know, just thinking of that lineup, that you have like James Holden there presenting a paper, you have Robert Zoller as two astrologers, but also major academics such as David Pingree was at that conference, and that would have been one of his last events where he presented a paper or published a paper. I think he ended up with a paper in that collection. So that's amazing, because he, I think, passed away maybe a year or two later in 2005, 2006.
Yeah, it was 2005, I think, the year after. And I met him and exchanged a few words with him. It was very nice. Wow. A very nice man.
Yeah, because he was the towering figure in work on the history of astrology in the late 20th century, just in terms of his output. And he was a polyglot that knew like a dozen ancient languages as well as several modern ones. And who else was at that conference?
Let me think. There were several people. So you had Pingree, you had Zoller, James Holden, you had Nick Campion was also there. You have Patrick Curry.
And I know the three main organizers were Koku van Stuckred, Daryl Rutkin, and Gunther Oostman, right?
Yeah, Gunther Oostman was there. Daryl, I'm not sure if he was there. I don't remember him there, but he might have been. I don't recall. Who else was there? Stephen Eileen was there as well. And several others whose names I cannot recall at this time, but they are part of that. They authored several papers on those books. There was also this historian who talked about Rome and some Roman charts.
Wolfgang Hubner?
Hubner was there as well, yes. But it wasn't Hubner, it was a lady. I think she passed away as well. I don't recall her name.
Yeah, I've got the collection of the contents of the published papers.
Yeah. Joseph Henriette Abri.
Yeah. So she was a major historian on the history of, or did some major work on the history of astrology. So that's a major conference, and you made a choice and you ended up being the one to attend, but then Helena did decide to go back to school later that year. Did that influence that at all, or had she already been trending in that direction?
She already been trending, because we had just published, before the conference, we had just published one of our first research books, which was called Royal Astrology, translating the title from Portuguese, which was a collection of charts of Portuguese kings.
Wow. Okay.
And for that, we needed to go to not only the chronicles, but also to the archives. And we had to research the archives for the where they had the description of the birth of the princess. And we ended up almost having all of them. And that was published in early 2004. And then I went to the conference after that. The book had already been published. So there were a lot of things already happening back then that were motivating us to study further, especially her, because she was already on track at that time. And so that was the main motivation for her degree and then the MA. Because she started in 2004, and by 2010 she was doing her MA. And that was the time when I suggested, why don't you contact Koku von Stuckrad? Because I recalled him from the conference. Why don't you contact him? Perhaps he can be your supervisor. And he was. He invited her to go to, what's the name? It wasn't Amsterdam. It was that up north in Holland. Oh, the name escapes. I'm terrible with names. But it's a big university up north, very famous, where John North lectured for many years.
You're not talking about the Warburg?
No, not the Warburg. He was in Holland. It'll come to me. She went there and presented her project for a group of teachers and to Koku von Sukrat, and he accepted to be her co-supervisor, which was very nice and give a lot of substance to her work, and also motivated her to really do a good work.
So, and he was one of her advisors, and she had two advisors for her master's, right?
Yeah, exactly. A Portuguese one.
Who was the second?
The second was Professor Maria de Lourdes Rosa. She studies, her line of studies, mainly medieval documentation and archives. She now has a very important ERC project exactly on that, the archives of families and legacies of families throughout the medieval period to the early modern. And that's her specialty. And she had been a teacher of Helena's, one of the teachers of the BA. So she went with her. She liked her a lot. I think that there was mutual agreement between them, in terms of talking. She liked her as a teacher, and she liked Helena as a pupil. So she was the main supervisor, and then Koku was a second supervisor.
Okay, I want to ask more about this, but I just remembered something, an anecdote, because you mentioned the 2004 conference and there being stories. I heard that Zoller presented kind of a weird paper, and I didn't mean to say earlier that they were left out and that was negative. Like maybe there's a reason that some of the papers didn't end up in the final compilation, but the way that he had conveyed the story was something like he gave a paper saying that astrology was the only true way of knowledge or knowing something for sure, like something to that effect. That sounded like a very not like academic position to take at an academic conference.
Yeah, now that I've been in academia for some time, his paper had a lot of problems. The first one, and most important one, he prepared an hour and a half length paper to what was supposed to be a 45 minute presentation. So he was completely out of proportion, and I don't know if he was confused about the time on duration, or if he thought that he would be allowed to speak for that time. But these conferences are very strict because everyone has to talk and you have to obey, the time limit. That happens with any conference.
There's just so many people and there's so limited time that in order to get them all in, you have to have very strict time limits.
Yeah, exactly. And that was one of the first problems, because he had to interrupt the paper in half.
Okay.
So he couldn't do the whole thing. It was impossible, That was one of the things. The other was the argument he was putting forth. He was arguing that, so along the lines of what you're talking, that astrology could be used as a tool to uncover unknown historical events.
Okay.
So astrology as a method for historical research itself. And that caused a lot of reaction.
Yeah, because while that's something an astrologer might take for granted or that astrologers do frequently, that's not a acceptable academic historical practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like extracting, as I sometimes say, just as a joke, doing historical interviews with a Ouija board, No, you can't say something like that, and expect a favorable reaction. And this is as a history of astrology conference. It's not an astrological conference. Yeah, that's a huge difference there. While, for example, Holden's paper was perfectly okay, and no one had no reaction at all in terms of negative. I don't think it was published. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but I think what he did was he more or less recycled something that he had already written. So he wasn't adding anything new. He was just making a compilation of stuff he had already published on the horoscopic astrology book, I think. So that's probably why it didn't end up being published. I'm not sure. But I know his relationship with the organizers, I know, was very cordial. There was never anything, problematic with him. The problem was just solar, really.
Yeah, I think Holden's paper was titled "What Will Happen Next," and because he sent me this paper, and I think we actually had him present it at an AFA conference in 2011 or so, or maybe it was a little bit later, that Ben and Dimitra and I did on traditional astrology, and it was one of his last talks, was just presenting this paper that was kind of an overview of the history of astrology, and especially ancient astrology.
Yeah. Yeah.
Here's the paper in case anybody wants it. So Zoller's didn't go over well. Well, that's just an interesting sort of cross point between astrologers doing some work on the history of astrology and academics that are starting to do work on the history of astrology, especially relative to where the direction that you and Helena would end up going, which ended up more and more going more in the academic direction. Well, I mean, it was both, because I think a few years later, you published your first major instructional book in 2007, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so by 2004, let me think, we were already starting to write that book, because that book took 3 years to write. It was out by 2007.
So you felt like by 2004 that you knew enough about traditional astrology and you'd been practicing it long enough that the two of you decided to start writing an instructional manual that's like an introduction to astrology from a traditional standpoint?
Exactly. And so we spent 3 years researching and carefully, planning, how do you explain this to someone that doesn't know a thing about astrology? That was quite a challenge.
Yeah.
Especially how to begin the book.
Because there literally were not any books like that up to that point, because even though there'd been earlier astrologers that had gotten into traditional astrology or had started lecturing and teaching on traditional astrology, like, Zoller only had his course, which was more of a private publication. In some ways, it wasn't like a published book that was like in bookstores. And others like, Project Hindsight had private little translations and taught courses, but they never published really a big book that was an introduction to astrology. And even somebody like Robert Hand ended up going back to school, which sort of preempted him from doing that and publishing a book. So yours was one of the first, and you published it in 2007. And what was the Portuguese title?
Tratado de Esferas, so the Treatise on the Spheres, which at the time the English publisher thought it was right for the English language, so it became On the Heavenly Spheres for the English version. Yeah.
Okay.
Which came out in 2010.
Okay, so On the Heavenly Spheres is the name of the English translation that was published by the American Federation of Astrologers in 2010, and that became a really influential book, I have to say, over the past 10 years, and that was actually translated, or Maria Mateus helped with that translation to help you translate it into English, right?
Yeah, she did basically all of it. She was fabulous. Her work was fabulous. She translated basically the whole thing. So there is no credit to her in the book, unfortunately. for some reason, but she should be credited. She is the translator of that book, and she did a wonderful job because it is a large book. And I think she should be credited for all the help she gave us.
Yeah, that was one of the books that was published during this almost like 10-year period where the AFA, there was a change in leadership, and one of the things that they started doing is they started publishing a lot of books, including all of James Holden's books, where he'd been translating all these texts for years, and then he finally, they published them all of a sudden in this very short span of time in the last decade of his life. But your book was also one of the ones that they published, and there were some really good things about that put it into circulation, but then there was sometimes some drawbacks about certain things that you might have done differently, and I think you did do differently in the Portuguese version, and are planning on doing a revised version of, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. At some point, we were planning that, and at some point we'll do that. And there's more to come out. We have the draft of a second book, which could continue this one. Let's see how it goes. But yeah, it was a very pleasant surprise for us, and I remember Helena saying this lots of times, that the book had the impact that it had, because here in Portugal, at the time he was published, it didn't have a very good reception.
Yeah, in 2007, I can't imagine it would have, because it would have been overwhelming. There wasn't an appetite for traditional astrology yet.
Not at all. And there was at the beginning a very strong resistance to traditional astrology. Sometimes very aggressive from modern astrologers, not here in Portugal, but also abroad. I think nowadays many mainstream astrologers that sort of, swallowed traditional astrology as something they have to incorporate or at least recognize and talk about in their practice, were very, very aggressive towards traditional astrology, especially if you stop using the so-called modern planets.
Right. Yeah, that was a big sticking point, is in the book, the two of you outline a system of astrology that just uses the 7 traditional planets. And this is drawn from, if you're writing it from 2004 to 2007, from those especially medieval and to some extent the Renaissance sources like Lilly, and the sort of synthesis that the two of you had put together at that point.
Yeah, exactly. And also stuff that we had learned by reading manuscripts, where you have practical examples and suddenly, okay, that's how they apply it, and that's very valuable. So we decided to do a book, and one of the things that we decided very early on, at first this was my idea, was to do a small book, with just sort of a glossary, not exactly a glossary, a small book, just outlining the main principles of traditional astrology. But then Helena was more of the opinion that it should be larger, it should be more explanatory, it should include much more. And that's the version that came out.
She was more ambitious.
Yeah, she was. She said, no, we should do it bigger. Not just a simple thing, but much, much bigger with good explaining every single little bit of the doctrine, of how it's applied, everything. And that's what it came. And it's a synthesis. My idea of traditional astrology, and when I say my idea, I say our idea, was always to create a synthesis. There are people who are period specific or author specific. For example, Sue Ward is an example of this. She works within a very concise, structured methodology, and that's her line of approach. We were of the idea that what you need to understand is what is the core principles that do not change throughout time and that are always consistent. And that is your go-to for any kind of traditional practice. And so that was one of the ideas or driving forces behind the book, is to go to those things which are really, really important and emphasize them. And also we wanted to write something that didn't rely on constantly quoting sources from the past. because most of the books that existed then, and we were coming from Zoller's work, and he's constantly quoting Bonatti, which is helpful, but we wanted a book that just explains the doctrine, with no footnotes, not keep going back to sources, just outline the principles, and then you go to the sources once you have them.
Yeah. Just looking at the book on Amazon, because it has like 134 reviews, and if you open up the table of contents, like you really get a sense for the scope of the book, which is amazing, in giving an overview of the history of astrology and going into the broader like philosophical and cosmological principles underlying traditional astrology, and then really breaking down all of the traditional concepts underlying an astrological chart in terms of planets, the signs of the zodiac, the essential dignities, the houses, aspects, and everything. Yeah, so that was a major undertaking, and the final book here is almost 300 pages. It looks like it's like 278 or so.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't initially received super well in Portugal. Did it take off eventually at some point later on?
It did. Nowadays, it's impossible to find the first edition, and for some years, it was almost impossible to find it. And then we decided to do a second edition at some point, and now it's on the third revised edition at this point that can be found in Amazon. But now it sells. It's one of the book people have, and a lot of things. And I think we talked about this before in the podcast. People are knowing the book from its English version. You sometimes have Portuguese people who are introduced to the book in English. So they are taking, for example, courses with tutors outside of Portugal, who then recommend a book that is written by two Portuguese, and people, wow, I didn't know that existed. And it's funny, it comes around. Yeah. And I remember when we spoke the first time in the podcast in 2018, Helena was quite moved when you told us that it has been an influential book in today's learning of astrology. She was very moved by that, because it's good. It's good to know that the work is being read, accepted, and there is a contribution, to the learning of astrology, because that was something that we always had in our minds, contribute to better astrology, to really consolidate the knowledge of astrology.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was always aware of it since 2010. I remember being at a United Astrology conference in Denver in 2008, and I was going to meet with the president, the head of the AFA, or maybe she wasn't the president, but Chris Risky, who was, and I saw her actually right before I had my meeting with her, sitting and talking to Maria Mateus, who was handing over the manuscript for the translation and kind of pitching the book in some sense. And then it was published with them 2 years later. But I was always aware of the book in the early 2010s because it was the only book for such a long time that gave an introduction to traditional astrology that I could refer, that was understandable and accessible, and also not just comprehensive, but also incredibly well illustrated with diagrams from your illustrations and stuff. So I put out like a top 10 6 beginner astrology books list in 2017 on my YouTube channel, when I started doing this channel and actually trying to put videos out once I finished writing my book in early 2017. And your book was on that list, actually. And I think that's one of the reasons, because it's been on my list of the best books, it sort of influenced then some of the younger generations of astrologers, where there's less resistance to traditional astrology compared to some of the older generations, where they were more used to doing it a certain way for enough decades that they're not as inclined to change, midstream. but it's become very popular with the younger generations.
Yeah. Sometimes I'm surprised to see it in these top tens. Yeah. I remember seeing yours, and then I've seen a few months ago, and it appears in top 5, books that people used in their learning process, and it's wonderful to have that feedback, of course.
Right. Yeah, I have some like B-roll footage that I shot of it like somewhere that I'll need to put up. Yeah. Anyway, so that was a major influence in terms of the history of the astrological community. And I remember in the late 2000s, the two of you also were launching a bunch of other projects, including the Tradition Journal, which was a journal that ran for 4 issues that was for astrologers, but it was meant to be a very well designed and very high level sort of discussions and articles about astrology. And you also had a website for that where you were running different projects. Like at one point there was like a house division research project and other things like that.
Yeah. We had the site, the website. We had the Tradition, which was those 4 issues that are now available online. And we have also the Tradition Library, which had original texts and transcriptions of texts, mainly early modern sources. That was mainly the work of Sue Ward and Peter Stockinger. And they published a lot of interesting sources on Lily's period, which was quite interesting. And that run as a charity. So the profits of all those sales went exclusively towards animal welfare. And we managed to help a large group of animals at the time with the money gathered from the sale of the Tradition, and that was quite nice.
Right, that was a major thing that was very important to both you and Helena, was deeply caring about animals and doing charity work.
Yeah, especially for her, she was very driven to animal welfare. Animal recognition of sentiency in animals. And she was a very active member of rescue groups that promoted animal well-being. She was not. She wasn't actually. She would go to places. She would do things, but she was always in the background, connecting people, giving ideas, giving support, and she has been missed terribly because people would search her for advice in how to deal with difficult situations. And so when she passed away, I created a fund So the idea initial was Helena never liked to receive flowers, because that means the flower would die. A plant was something else, potted plant. It was okay, but not for flowers. So I told people not to hand out flowers for her, not to buy flowers, but to contribute to this fund. And fortunately, the fund has been working, and we have been able to help, a lot. It's not something huge, but it's to help associations that sometimes have difficulty in neutering animals or paying vet bills of difficult cases. So we lend help as much as we can with that.
What's the URL of the website for that?
Well, it's in Portuguese. It's Fundo Helena Avelar. Fundo Helena Avelar at weebly.com. So this was a page I built up very, very rapidly. That photo, that black and white photo, is of Helena in her journalist years, and she did a lot of pieces on animals, and that's her on the zoo petting tigers. There's a lot of pictures of her, with lion cubs on her lap and dolphins. She has quite a collection, and I thought this was one interesting.
That's great.
And the tigers. Yeah. And this was a page I did very quickly to promote the fund. So if people want to contribute whatever they want, and they can, I can guarantee that this is going to be used to help whatever comes by, in terms of assistance, food, vet bills mainly, for associations that sometimes struggle with the amount of animals that are abandoned or get run over or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that as a really notable thing when you two were doing all of your astrological work, just that the funds were being donated for, I think it was for like the subscriptions for the Tradition journal were being donated to different animal causes.
Yeah, exactly. We helped. I remember one in particular was, we helped two that I recall was one large animal shelter in Algarve in the south of Portugal, and which it was this English lady who ran that, and she picked up strays and abandoned dogs and then tried to rehome them, most of them outside of Portugal, and she did an amazing job. And so we contribute for her to pay bills, be able to take the animals to the vet, and go have funds to go over all that process, and that you spend money getting the licenses and everything. And there was also a charity in another Portuguese town, Évora, which has done an amazing work in recovering animals, cats and dogs. And they also got a big chunk to help them recover from all the vet bills again, which is usually the problem for these associations, which are basically run by the people, by the group. There's very little official assistance here in Portugal for those cases. Nowadays, it's getting better, but still.
Right.
A lot of the costs come out from the people, of the volunteers, that work with this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So I think at this point, we reach a crossroads from my understanding of Helena's story and your story to some extent as well, where even though you, from my perspective, were very prominent in the astrological community around the late 2000s and early 2010s through, publishing that book and through starting to publish a journal for astrologers that went through, I think, 4 volumes of the Tradition journal, as well as a website and an online library. At that point, there was a shift where the two of you kind of disappeared, at least from my perspective, from the astrological community. And I would realize later, when you sort of reemerged, that what happened is that the two of you really went deep into your academic studies at this point. And for her, that would have been the point where she started working on getting a PhD and doing a PhD thesis.
Yeah, that coincides. Well, it coincided with her master's.
Okay.
Because this was the Tradition stopped being published in 2010 or 2011. I don't recall exactly. That was when I then started to go again into the university, and Helena was finishing at that time her MA. So when both of us were at the university, it became a little hard to maintain the publications and especially the Tradition. The Tradition also suffered from something which was there weren't enough people, producing traditional work to feed the Tradition, so it could maintain the rhythm. So we decided to stop because it was becoming too strenuous, and we had to write also pieces, just to keep the journal in functioning. So we decided, and then the Traditional library came in that sort of replaced that for a while. But at that time, I was starting my BA, my third attempt at at the university. I went to art history, and then she was doing her finishing her MA and then going to the PhD.
So for her PhD, she actually went to the Warburg Institute in London, which is a very famous institution that was started almost a century ago for studying topics that are normally a little bit outside of the scope of like the typical history topics, right?
Yeah, exactly. She asked for advice at the time, where she could do a PhD on astrology, because she could have done it in Portugal, but there wasn't really a line of those studies here. So a lot of our friends and teachers at the time advised her to contact the Warburg Institute, and she did. And Charles Burnett accepted to talk to her and to look at the material and to consider her as a possible student under his supervision. So she went there, and they got along very well. He liked the topic. He thought the topic was promising. And at this time, and this was where it gets interesting, at this time, Helena wanted to do something on astrology, but she wasn't sure exactly how to approach it, what to do exactly. There were many possibilities. And then I remembered this manuscript that we had found in the National Archive long ago. And we had reached that by reading that was Helena who found it, by reading a footnote on a work by a Portuguese historian who said something like, this manuscript contains charts, astrological charts. At the end, it was tables, and he was more interested in the tables. And then astrological charts that could have been done for any date or time, which was sort of an absurd remark to be done. And we were very curious. Wait a minute, horoscopes? So we went to see the manuscript. And after flicking through, and this was a microfilm, to many screens of tables, which are interesting in themselves, but there's a limited interest to seeing tables. Suddenly, horoscopes and charts starting to appear, and we were amazed at the amount of material that was there. And I remember we jumping up and down almost in the library. Wow, fabulous, because there was no record of anything like that in the Portuguese archives by that time. And we got a copy, and we kept that for a number of years. We couldn't read it at first because this was in Latin, and we didn't have enough paleography to read it. And as time progressed, we learned how to read it. And so I suggested to Helena, why don't you try this one? This one has enough material there to make us, become a start for doing something, a connection between perhaps Portugal, France, what's happening here, how did the manuscript came to be, etc. And so she advanced with that project.
So the manuscript is actually available online from is it from the Portuguese library that actually has it in Lisbon?
It's the National Archive in Lisbon, yeah.
Okay. So, and it's this old manuscript, and it's written, so this is from the 15th century. So this is before, the printing press, and this is like the private, or one of the private notebooks of some astrologer who wrote in his own hand, and it's written in Latin.
Yeah, it's an amazing manuscript because he copied by hand a set of tables that he was using himself.
Okay.
This browser isn't, this archive browser is not very good. There it is.
Yeah.
MS 1711. There you have, that's the table part. There are several pages of tables, which he was using in his practice with the positions of the planets. And then he has a collection of horoscopes at the very end of the manuscript of famous people of France, the rich and the famous celebrities of France, of 15th century France at that time, the kings, the dukes, the major political figures. And surprisingly, his own children and family and people he knew probably. Which is amazing because what Helena later found out is that this is the largest known collection before the early modern period. So it's the earliest collection of charts known. There's nothing as big at this period, as large.
So from prior to the 17th century, it's the largest collection of charts?
16, because by the 16th century, you have those collections by Cardano and authors of that period, that published these collections of famous nativities. That becomes a genre on itself in the printed version. This is the earliest collection.
And could you show like an image from Helena's book of one of the charts? Did we pull up a page for that earlier? Do you have one that you could show just to give people watching the video version just an idea of what these charts looking like? I'm trying to click through it in the manuscript, but it's kind of slow loading on this website.
Yeah, let me get a good one.
Like this one does have, for example, one of the almanacs that lists planetary positions.
Yeah, exactly. That's the almanac. So there you have the Sun, Moon, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Mercury, and the North Node. That is not the South Node, but the North Node.
Right. I posted this on an image from her book on Twitter. I was surprised nobody noticed that everyone commented on the other glyphs, and everyone thought it was really interesting seeing how the symbols were. Some of them were the same as now, but some of them were very different. But one everybody overlooked so far is that the nodes are reversed from what they usually are in modern astrology.
Exactly, because it depends on how you see north. Because nowadays we tend to see north as up, because we're used to that position in the charts. But if you think about it, for a long time, and astrologically, the north is down. Because in the northern hemisphere, we're looking at south when we're talking about the MC and the culmination point of the planets. So the south node is represented going up, so south, while the north node is represented going north, so down. And that's very tricky. You need to be very careful. Yeah, here it is, the table.
Yeah. So this is a table from Helena's book, and it shows all the symbols for the signs of the zodiac and the planets, and then the aspects and other things. And some of them look, very similar or exactly the same as the symbols today. Like Aries is very close, Gemini and Cancer are very close.
Yeah.
But Leo, there's some of them. Yeah.
I think the strangest one is Taurus, which looks like Scorpio.
Right. And it looks very, very close to Scorpio. It's just got one little leg that's in addition that sets it apart.
Exactly. It's the only way to set them apart is the number of legs. So Taurus has more for some reason. Sagittarius is also odd because that's a very, very, very stylized arrow. And Capricorn, which it's drawn strangely from what we're used to.
Yeah, and then the symbol for Mars looks like the modern symbol for Sagittarius.
Exactly, yeah.
The symbols for Saturn and Jupiter just look completely different.
Yeah, the symbol for Saturn is very close to the symbol of Capricorn that we have now. It goes down, that kind of thing, and then he crosses it. It's very close to the symbol of the actual symbol for Capricorn, and that's a very common symbol for Saturn during the Middle Ages. And Jupiter, it's the same symbol we use now, but instead of having the curve outwards, it's inwards. So it's more or less the same symbol, but with an extra leg and crossed. Yeah.
Right. And then most of the aspects are very similar. The sextile is the only one that's odd because it looks like a hashtag.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it looks like the cardinal glyph. It's strange. I don't know why he didn't do the star. I have no idea.
And then there's the nodes.
Yeah, the nodes are reversed, which is something people should pay attention when they're looking at, especially medieval charts. By the early modern period, that's not longer an issue, but earlier than that it is, because they're reversed. For example, the Arabs cartography has south is pointing upwards.
Okay.
Like in an astrological chart. So the node is also reversed. So we need to be attentive to that.
So this is something that Helena and you had to learn was how to read the symbols within the context of their time period, and how to learn paleography, which is like reading the handwriting of authors who are writing in manuscripts prior to the inventing of the printing press.
Exactly, which sometimes is abbreviated, and there's methodologies of abbreviation specific to certain periods. So you need to know that, and if you don't, you look at that and it looks like gibberish. But then once you learn, you can always read something, even if it's a tough hand. But you can always read something. Yeah, once you cross that frontier.
So the first part of the book contains a bunch of tables of planetary positions, sort of like an ephemeris for a certain range of years. But then the end of the book contains a bunch of charts for different types of astrological charts.
Yeah, it has mostly natal charts, but it has some coronation charts, and what they would call in the old days the entrance of the king in the city, because that would be ceremonial, something important. Once the king entered the city, that would mark a certain power that the king would acquire. So that was also a chart that you see erected, and you see that a lot in old elective sources, sections for elections, where how to enter a city, and that's usually to be used in this kind of situation where the king or the nobleman or whoever has power is going to assume power over that city.
Okay. So that's the ascension to the throne, basically, or ascension chart, sort of?
Yeah. It's an equivalent. Yeah.
Okay. So do you want to show an image of one of the charts?
Yeah, let me just pick a good one that has enough information.
On the website, which I think I'll put a link to in the description on the podcast website, it's like you can click through, but I'm just having a hard time making it big enough to read too much, but you can see these diamond-shaped charts was his style.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Did you find one?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, here you go.
Okay, let me share that. This is a good one. Okay.
Wow. Okay, so this is it's a diamond-shaped chart, and then it has notes written around the edges of something.
Yeah, exactly. For example, he says, et fuit dies Saturni, ora solis, al mutem Saturni. So the day of Saturn, the hour of Saturn, and Saturn was the almutin. And then you can see the calculation of the almutin here in the side, where he's adding the different qualities, the different dignities that the planet has, and Saturn pops up with the greatest number of dignities.
Okay, so he's calculating the strongest or the most powerful planet in the chart, which is the almutin, or I guess Ben Dykes calls it the victor of the chart.
Yeah. The almutin, the lord of the geniture, the lord of the figure. Right. There are many names for this. And here then, in this small bracket, you have the calculation of longevity, in which he says that moon is eleg. And if I'm not mistaken, in this case, he says the moon is both the eleg and the alcucodum of the chart. And this is because the moon is exalted, as it's in Taurus. So you see Gemini here. So the moon is in Taurus. So because it's exalted, is one of the rules that you find in most sources with the longevity, is that the moon or the sun, if they are in their own exaltations, they can be their own alcucodum. So
okay, so he's calculating things like the overall ruler of the chart, but then he's also trying to calculate different points to use for things like longevity or the length of life calculation.
Yeah, exactly. Here you have the year of the chart. So 1423, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, exactly.
Okay, and where's the ascendant in this diamond chart?
It's here. So this is the first house. So the ascendant degree is here on this.
On the left.
Yeah. So it's going to be 19 degrees, 10 minutes of Sagittarius.
Got it. Okay. And then we can see some of the symbols for the planets, and he's written the degrees and the minutes next to most of them.
Yeah, let me amplify this a little bit more so we can see it easily. So you can see, and this is important, you see, for example, here, pars fortunae, so the part of fortune here. Here you see vultur cadens, vultur volans, so these are fixed stars. This is the part of the king and the kingdom. What does he have here? The part of death here.
Okay, so
this
he's calculating
is the part of death according to Hermes. So pars mortem secundum hermetem. Cor Scorpi, so the Antares.
Right, the heart of the scorpion.
The heart of the scorpion. And then he does these very interesting things, which is he highlights in red planets that for some reason he thought were important.
Okay.
It doesn't do a delineation of the chart, so we don't know exactly why is he selecting these particular planets, but he sometimes does that. He highlights, and you see that a lot in these workbooks. They highlight. It's like you're looking at a chart. Imagine today the equivalent is you're going to have a consultation. You print out the chart. You have the page there, and you just with a pencil or with a pen, you just highlight and mark things that you think are significant. So he's doing the same.
Okay. So let's back up then and tell the story about this. So Helena, 10 years earlier in the early 2000s, the two of you had come across this notebook, this text that was anonymous in the library in Lisbon. But then 10 years later, in the early 2010s, when she's starting to think about what to do her PhD thesis on, that's when there's a decision to focus on this text. And she ends up going to the Warburg Institute and working with Charles Burnett, who, to give some context, is probably the leading historian on medieval astrology in the world, especially at this point, definitely, but especially after the death of David Pingree in 2005 or 2006. It seems like Burnett is one of the leading historians on astrology in general in the world. So she's studying with him, which is a major deal just in and of itself. But then she decides to start focusing on this text that the two of you had only sort of looked at a little bit earlier.
Yeah, exactly. We did transcribe most of the charts, so the charts are transcribed in her book are already things that we did early on to have a more clear view of the chart, and she does. And so what she does is at the time she applies for a grant from the Portuguese government, and at first she didn't obtain it due to a clerical error, which is the most frustrating thing that can happen.
Right.
You're almost there, the evaluation is positive, but then there's a mistake which you're not to blame, and you don't get the grant. But then she reapplied again, and they attribute to her. She got a high position in scoring.
And that's a big deal because she was given a full grant from the Portuguese government to do her PhD dissertation, which allowed her to move to London and study at the Warburg Institute, and for I think like 4 years, right?
4 years, yeah, 4 years, during 4 years, and have the wonderful opportunity of being at the Warburg. The Warburg is an experience. I didn't have it directly as she had, but I know a lot of people who were colleagues and which I know, and the Warburg is an experience. I've been there myself a couple of times, and it's this fabulous library. It has this fabulous library where you have a whole corridor on the history of astrology with books and papers that you had no idea that existed. It's absolutely amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. So probably every it's probably the best or one of the best libraries for the history of astrology in the world, having just about every book you would want to find, both in terms of like critical editions of texts in their original language or translations or books on the history of astrology and other things like that.
Yeah, and it has this huge collection of very obscure papers, sometimes important, that sometimes have sources or discussions on sources that you had no idea that existed. And because the Warburg is organized in a very peculiar way, so it's not like a regular library where things are cataloged as they come. In the Warburg Library, things are cataloged by theme. So when you have direct access to the books. So once you get to the shelf where your book that you're looking for is, it's most likely that in the surrounding volumes will be about the same subject.
Right. So that's amazing. So it will immediately, once you are looking for a book and you find it, you immediately find like 10 other books that are on the same subject that you didn't know existed.
Exactly. And there is a lot of topics that are good in the Warburg Library, but the main ones are history of astrology, history of magic, and history of art in general. As when I was doing my BA in art history, I went there a few times, and the corridors of art history are also fabulous. The whole library is amazing. But you do have a very strong collection. And as you said, probably the largest collection on the history of astrology and also on the history of magic, which I cannot evaluate because I don't know what collections are on that topic. But it's huge. Huge.
Yeah, but for example, like David Pingree did his critical edition of the Picatrix in the 1980s, and I think that was published through the Warburg Institute in like 1980 something, just to give an idea in terms of the history of magic. And then there also have been other major books that have been published on the history of astrology, like I think J.D. North's Horoscopes and History, which is on the history of house division, was published by the Warburg Institute in 1988 or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Which we mentioned last time we did the podcast. Yeah, that's the seminal work on the history of house divisions, and that's also Warburg Institute edition. So there are a number of things. It's amazing, an amazing place. So, and she had the opportunity, and she was very, very lucky, and she was very fortunate to be there, and she loved London. She loved the Warburg Institute. She loved the people. She really liked that period of her life. No, she was in love, like most people that went to war. She was in love with the place.
Yeah, because she was a astrologer and she was a researcher, and then she was able to combine those two things because from her previous career as a journalist and somebody good at investigating things, and combined those two things and was able to do that as a primary focus. And sometimes people don't understand that until you get caught by that feeling or that bug that draws you into studying the history of astrology. It can be a really fun thing to study just in and of itself for its own sake, and especially if you have a subject that you're interested in researching more, and a place like a library or something that has lots of resources to do that. It can be a very all-encompassing sort of thing to focus on.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And astrology was definitely Helena's passion, as it is mine. And she felt very privileged to be able to study there and to attain this scholarship, because it's not easy. Especially at the age she was in, because she didn't start young. Most people are doing their PhD by their late 20s, early 30s, and she was doing that much later in life. So she felt that she had to take advantage of this opportunity that life had brought to her, and she had fight for. So she did the best work possible.
So she was in her late 40s or early 50s by this point?
Early 50s, yeah. Late 40s, early 50s.
And she also would have been one of the first astrologers to have the honor or sort of privilege of studying the history of astrology and working on a PhD on the history of astrology at the Warburg Institute I think there was maybe one other before her or contemporary, which would be Dorian Greenbaum.
Dorian
Right?
Greenbaum, yeah. I think Dorian Greenbaum, I don't know everyone that studied that, but as far as I know, Dorian Greenbaum was the first astrologer, practice astrologer to go to the Warburg and to be able to be there as a PhD researcher and to be accepted there. And as Helena said many times, Dorian opened the door, for other people to do serious research, because the Warburg Institute is very selective in terms of its students. You really need along the process to prove that you are able to do a proper academic research. You're not accepted as a PhD student until your second year of study. You have to pass through a period of proof in which you have to prove that your research is worthy, and that you are able to be to uphold the standards that the institute demands. So it's quite an accomplishment, I have to say. It's quite an accomplishment. And Dorian opened that door. Helena was next. I don't know if other people, probably there are more, but I'm not that I know of. Yeah.
Sure. So she had to sort of prove herself and perform at or above a certain level, so that despite her otherwise interest in astrology privately, or the fact that she had been a practicing and teaching astrologer that actually published astrology books, that wasn't going to interfere with or in any way make her work less than other historians who were not astrologers. But in fact, it seemed like part of what she also wanted to prove was that there was some things that she could bring to the table that were actually assets as a result of her background in astrology.
Exactly. And that was something that Charles Burnett recognized in her, the ability to bring her knowledge of astrology as a practitioner, and she was a practitioner of that tradition by then, to the academic research. So you get a new insight into the reading of the documents that you are studying, and that is quite valuable. But you still need to perform at an academic level. For example, she had to pass a Latin text, a medieval Latin text, and a medieval French text before she was admitted into the PhD. Because she has to prove. Knowing traditional astrology is not enough. She has to prove that she has the academic skills to perform and do a proper academic research, and she did.
Yeah, and so part of that as a classic scholar or historian of science is having high level language skills.
Yeah, it is. You need to know Latin at least if you're working with European sources. And it's always good to know a little bit of Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, depending on what kind of sources you're working on.
Which is no small thing. I mean, even if languages come easily to somebody, which is, partially a skill and partially like a sort of gift, it's still like learning a new language or an ancient language is still something that requires some work.
Yeah. And it's not easy. It's not something that you learn in a year or two. Even if you dedicate full time, it's difficult. Then you need years to develop the skills, to translate, to understand the subtleties of language, because it's not just reading it. You need to understand the nuances of the language to really be able to translate and to understand the content. And that takes years of work. Yeah. So you need a lot of effort. I still struggle with Latin sometimes. And I've been working with Latin texts for quite some years now. It's an ongoing skill that you have to develop, especially if you don't come from a language background.
Yeah, picking up new languages is not something that comes easily to me. So I'm always in awe of people like Helena who have multiple languages and can read multiple languages and able to do work in them at that level is really impressive and is a huge asset for any astrologer or any historian. So there was like a stroke of luck that happened somewhere around this point that set up the rest of her story and made her PhD thesis even more interesting. And this happened at the Warburg, and I think it was Charles Burnett who initially set her down this path, right, where he said that she should talk to this other scholar since she was looking at this notebook that was anonymous and they didn't know where it came from, that you two had found 10 years earlier. He said he recognized something and you should talk to this other scholar about it.
Yeah, the thing was that this document was good, but they were a bit afraid that it was not enough. There would need to be added more documents to give a good view of the practice at that period, etc. So this was the first year, so they were still exploring how to approach the topic and how to approach the document. So, and then Charles remembered, why don't you speak with David Just? And David Just is a scholar who, in the last decades, have been compiling, the lists of existing manuscripts in the libraries. And he had just studied the astrological manuscripts and published a book on a catalog on the astrological manuscripts of the National Library of France.
Of the Latin manuscripts specifically, right?
Yes, exactly. The Latin manuscripts. So I think this was in the Christmas party of the Warburg Institute, by the end of the semester. And David Just was there. And Helena went and sat with him. And she opened her computer with the PDF of the manuscript. He opened the images that he had from the manuscript, and suddenly it was the same script, the same hand, the same symbols, the same way of drawing the charts, and better yet, there were charts that were repeated in the two manuscripts. And so suddenly, she said that she just ran up to Charles and said, "We found it. It's the same man. It's the same author," and she was very happy about that.
And in her telling of it in the other interview, she said she was exclaiming and she was so excited that initially Charles Burnett thought something was wrong or that she got in a fight with David Just or something like that. But that wasn't, she had to clarify, no, we found out there's another manuscript that exists by the same author. So now we have two of his works, and this other one just came from some library in France, so completely removed in a completely different country.
Yeah, exactly. And how it was signed. So it is signed by an S. Belle, which is assumed by some historians that it's Simon Belle, but we're not sure. There's no... it's a possibility, but not a certainty. And suddenly you had more charts, already a good collection of charts that she had added to another collection of charts, and text, excerpts of works for several authors, a delineation of 3 different charts, some copied from elsewhere, another one that Helena has more or less proven or assumed or proposed with good evidences that is done by Belle himself, because it's done in French and not in Latin like the other ones. And so the two together they complement each other. So when the almanac is missing or it has few notations, it's the time where the other book is being written. So there is a strong connection between the two. So they are part of the same workbook, and that is amazing. And from there, she could build, a whole thesis out of it, and yes, she did.
And so she had a name. She had now a name to give to this person, S. Belle, who might be Simone Belle, but you're not sure. And she had now 2 of his works instead of just 1. So here's this one is also available online through the French library, and it's a very old-looking book. And
you should go to...
Do you know what page his signature's on?
No, not by heart.
Here we go. And so it's handwritten manuscript, and most of it's in Latin again.
Yeah.
Okay. So that then becomes enough for her to write a PhD thesis then and start working on a PhD thesis on this previously unknown astrologer. And he uses enough dates, and he also writes dates sometimes, like what date he was writing a certain passage, so that you were able to date it. That she was able to date it to the middle and second half of the 15th century, and that he was living in France.
Yeah, exactly. The core of the work, and she would love to be here explaining this to you, is to demonstrate the practice of an astrologer of that period, because most of what we know about the astrological practice comes from primers, source books, not from practical examples of the application of knowledge.
Yeah, so we have a lot of, from the past 2,000 years, like instructional texts where somebody like Ptolemy sits down and writes 4 books to outline the theory of astrology, and these are all the techniques, and this is the theory of how this works. But sometimes they don't even have chart examples. Like Ptolemy, for example, doesn't have any chart examples. But this, for the first time, was actually two private notebooks from a practicing astrologer, and you could get an insight into his actual practice.
Exactly. And we have those kinds of examples from later, from the 17th century, some the 16th century. We do have that, you have Cassell's work on Simon Foreman, for example, in which they're studying their workbooks. But that's much later. This is very early, and it's very rare that you find such a manuscript from this time period. It's like 500 years from now, an historian being able to read your book on Hellenistic astrology, but having the luck of finding notes from your consultations or from your personal studies, etc. And although the book is important, even more valuable is those direct testimonies of what you were actually doing. Because most of the time, and people forget about this when they study the history of astrology, is that what we see in the books, it's doctrine, it's theoretical knowledge. We really don't know if they applied all of that into practice, even when they give examples. Because sometimes when we see what they do in their daily astrological practice, it's quite different. So they don't use the whole spectrum of techniques. They specialize on this one. It's a whole other universe that opens up, and this is the strong core of Helena's book and Helena's thesis, is that she explores as much as she can what is he doing, what is his knowledge, what is his approach to practice, and it's fabulous. It's fabulous. You have calculations of longevity, examples of calculation of the Almutin, which is something you'd see in books, but you rarely see practical examples of a living astrology applying that, and other stuff, predictive techniques, oraries, elections. So you have a rich idea of what is he studying, what is he thinking it's important, what is he considering. So that's the strong point. For example, one of the things which is amazing in his book is the lots. He uses a lot of them. And for example, in the mundane charts, and he has a huge section where he notes mundane charts and he makes notations about that, he uses a lot of those weird lots. The lots of wool and the lots of meat and the lots of sugar, of sweet things and stuff like that, which we think, well, they're not really going to use that. Apparently they did.
Okay. So did he use the lot of lentils? That's one of my favorite, obscure lots.
I'm not sure the Latin, but he does have the lot of beans, I think.
Okay.
I'm not sure if it's the same, but it's close enough.
Close enough. I'll take it.
Yeah, and they use that, for example, to understand the quality, the amount of that produce in a certain year, the prices. Are they going up? Are they going down? Is it going to be accessible? Is it going to be more expensive because it's rare? And that's very interesting because we do not have many examples of that application.
Right. So one of the manuscripts contains a table of planetary positions that's dated 1469 through 1480. So that's roughly his time period, and that places him, just to give people like a context, that's 200 years after the time period roughly of Guido Bonatti, but about 200 years before the time period of William Lilly. So that's a really interesting middle ground period where sometimes when you say, somebody says 15th century, you think, well, that's Renaissance or early modern astrology, but it's not. It seems like that was something Helena was clear about, that it's actually medieval or late medieval astrology still.
Yeah, it's still late medieval. So this is more or less contemporary, a little later than Regiomontanos, for example.
Okay.
So it's around that time. So it's mid 15th century to late 15th century. And it's a period of which we do not know that much. We know a lot about late early modern period. So late 17th century, we know a little bit more, especially the British authors. We know something about the medieval period with the Arabs and all that transmission to the Latin world. But there are huge gaps in our knowledge of the late medieval period and the early modern 16th century. 16th century is a black hole in terms of our knowledge of what is happening with astrology in that period. That's the area which I'm studying. Because we usually do a jump from Middle Ages then to Lilly, because those are the more available sources, of course, for everyone. But to make that jump, it's quite a huge jump. So a lot of things have changed in between, Yeah.
We usually jump from like Bonatti, who's like circa 1300, to Lilly, who's like 1647, and that's a long gap.
Yeah. A lot of things changed in astrology back then, perspectives, philosophies, points of view, applications, which are not mapped.
So this author shows up during that time period. He was previously not known and hadn't been studied, and those two notebooks that survive, one in a library in Portugal and one in France, had not been recognized as being by the same author until Helena had this discovery with David Just at the Warburg Institute, and then she sets out to study it and make that the focus of her PhD thesis, which she eventually completed in what year?
She completed in 2018, and the date of grant of her PhD is right the last day of 2018. So that's where the official date of the PhD says. She did her evaluation in October or November of 2018. That's when she passed her Viva. And this French manuscript was known. It had been described. It had been addressed by some known historians, like Jean-Patrice Baudet, which is a huge historian of astrology in France, and he had delved into it. But when suddenly this other manuscript comes by, then it makes that even huge. It's huger. It's much larger than expected. Because what was an interesting collection of charts becomes a fabulous collection of charts. And that is amazing.
Right. Once she recognized that this this book from the Portuguese library was by the same author. So it has, how many charts are in it? One of the books contains something like 40 or 50 charts.
Yeah. I don't know the total. I don't recall what's the total charts, but it's huge.
Okay. And one of the things that you mentioned earlier is one of them actually contains birth charts for all of his children, or at least like 5 different children who were all born almost in succession, one year after another.
Yeah, exactly. I remember that was one of the first charts that we managed to read. And he said, Martha filia mea. So Martha, my daughter. And we thought, oh, that's interesting. You have the French kings, and then wait a minute, it's his daughter. And he has also 2 boys or 3, I don't recall. 2 boys that die at a very early age. And there is this Martha, and there I think there's a 3rd boy that apparently survived because he doesn't make note of his death. And that is quite interesting. And he also has cousins and uncles and that kind of family, near family along with his charts, and that is quite interesting. Yeah.
In some of the earlier authors, like Hephaestus of Thebes or Manetho or David Pingree thought even Vedius Valens, there was this one chart that Valens kept using over and over again that Pingree suggested might be Valens' own chart. Did Helena ever think that there was one chart in there that could be Belle's chart, the author's chart, or has he never mentioned one that's close?
No, there's none that leads us to suspect that. Nothing.
That's too bad. I noticed in her list in the book that there was one that's listed as because there's names or the owner of the birth charts are known and stated in a bunch of them, but there's one where it's encoded, I think is what she said.
Yeah, exactly. There are several which are encoded. There's one in the Lisbon manuscript, and I think several in the other manuscript. He replaces the vowels by numbers. So A equals to 1. And go on until U. So the vowels are letters. So to mask the name. And what she suspects, and that's her argument, is that these were sensitive people, very important people who were in a sensitive position, and to be doing their chart could mean that you would have a specific political allegiance. So if someone would get your notebooks, if those names were there, you might be in trouble because they might suspect you were allied with this one and this one. And this is a period in France where there's a lot of internal wars for power. This is the time of King Louis XI, which there are a lot of forces against the king, and alliances against the king, and that's very interesting. So he probably was very weary of certain charts, so that they were not directly visible in the book, in the notebook, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, that even though it's his private notebooks and collections of notes and things and charts, that there's some where he still had to be careful to mask or to hide the identity of the owner of that chart.
Yeah, exactly. And another interesting thing about is also the tables, because in the tables he has several notations, side notations, and some of them are important events of the time. Wars, usually wars or comets or heavy rains, earthquakes, notable events, and that he notes on the side of the tables, and sometimes gives the planetary positions, the ascendant at the time. He calculates the ascendant or the moon position, something like that. And that is also very interesting.
Okay.
So he's accompanying the politics of his time, and noting it in his ephemeris.
Right. He's noting what were the correlations between celestial movements and earthly events.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And one of the books, I think it was the one from France, has actual excerpts from some texts where he was copying down from different texts from earlier astrologers, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So he probably didn't have the books, so he didn't have those manuscripts, so he's copying the parts that he's interested in, This is pre-printing, or printing is just coming up at this point in time. So it's very recent technology, probably not one he has access to at this time. So he has to copy manuscripts. So if you have a book that has an interesting segment, you're going to copy it because you want to read it later on. And it's a lot of work. He copies a table, several years of a table so he can work. Imagine having to copy by hand ephemeris.
The ephemeris, right? Okay. So he's copying planetary tables so that he knows where the positions were for some specific period that he wants to study.
Yeah, exactly. Probably because he doesn't have access to a library easily access to a library where we could go and consult it. He has to have his own copy.
Right. Who were some of the sources that he drew on in terms of earlier medieval astrologers?
I think it's in Marshala he does John of Ascendon, who does a very important work on mundane astrology. And is one of the major sources of mundane astrology for the early modern period. He's an English author. Who else?
I know one of them was like a commentary. There was a section on the significations of the houses where Helena says that he writes a date after he finished writing that, which was February 1st, 1473. And I think she said it was from a commentary on Al-Kabizi.
Probably. I don't recall exactly who all the authors were, but yeah, he has a lot of Arabic authors. The traditional ones, the ones that we still today we quote in tradition. He has also some others of his time, so he has connections with astrologers of his own time, French and German astrologers. And so he's part of a larger network. And this is also something important, There is a network of communication between astrologers very early on. But that is, it's the type of documents or that never survive or very rarely survive, And he quotes them in like sources of his times. There are certain charts where there are several times, or charts of kings or princes, and he notes this is from a certain astrologer. He gets the source, who gave him that time.
So they were exchanging like birth data of some of the like kings and events and other things.
Exactly.
Nice. Okay. So there's like an underground like network of astrologers kind of exchanging information with each other in ways that are kind of similar. I guess that still happens today, actually. Astrologers exchange charts, or, if you were there or witnessed or saw on the news this chart, you wrote down the time and somebody might get that from you at some point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As you see, for example, in the Hellenistic sources, when they have these charts where they don't say who it is, but it's obvious who it is. It's the emperor, and you know exactly who it is, but they never name it so that they don't get it wrong. This one was born, at a certain point, and you know perfectly well who it is by the dates, by the description, but they're not naming it. But still, it circulates, the charts of the emperors, the charts of the main generals. And I remember a couple of years ago, there were still a lot of charts, for example, from Vettius Valens to identify, because certainly those are important political figures, important figures in society of that period. But who are they? Some is obvious, some are not.
I think James Holden identified one of them as Nero that hadn't been identified previously, or in Hephaestos, some of the modern historians identified one of the charts as the Emperor Hadrian.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Yeah. And here you see the same thing. I remember that was someone that it's a lady, which is a certain famous lady, which probably by that period everyone would know who she was, but we don't know anymore. And it's difficult to know unless you know very particular, very specific events of that society of that time. Perhaps you can identify it, but Helena couldn't, and she was always very frustrated because she couldn't identify all the charts that she had.
How many of the charts that were identified are ones where the author, you don't have to give an exact number, but it seems like there were many where there are a number of kings and stuff that there's charts, and are those named in the manuscript, or how many did Helena herself, was she able to infer or figure out just based on the date that was given?
I suppose that a lot of them, she probably identified around 5 to 6 that she was able to know exactly who that person was, or at least had a strong suspicion of who it was. Others, she makes some suggestions, but she wasn't sure. She wasn't sure who they were. She had suspicions because of the position of the chart, the way he dealt with it. I remember there was one which they were unsure if it was a man or a woman because of the way the title was given. And what gives out is the way the part of marriage is calculated. Because the part of marriage changes from a man or to a woman and inverts. So she was able to confirm it's really a woman because the part of marriage is calculated as if it were for a female chart. So that is interesting. That's where astrology can come. Another thing, for example, that she very early on noticed is that figures which are identified and whose date of birth is not historically known. And if you go to a history book about that figure, it said, oh, she was born about this year, sometime in this year, or the first. And then there's an astrological chart. It has the exact date and the time. So certainly then you have biographical data, which can come from these documents that can give you more historical details about this person. What year exactly was this person born? And from there you can infer other historical consequences of that, which child was born first, what was happening in the life of that important figure when the firstborn or the secondborn came to be, Sometimes it's important data for people studying the period.
Yeah, so it's actually providing really valuable historical information for historians that's coming from being able to study and analyze the astrological content of these texts.
Yeah, exactly. For example, there is a couple which had, I think they didn't have children. I don't recall exactly the details because at the time Helena was writing this, I was already involved in my own PhD, so I accompanied it, but I don't know the details. And sadly, I haven't been able to read the book since I got it. I did all the indexing and all of that because it was required. Charles Burnett, of which I have to thank a lot because he was extremely kind and helpful with the revising, the revising of the book for printing. He did a lot of the work, but I haven't read it again since Helena passed away, and so I don't recall the details, but I was remembering this couple, and they either had difficulty in conceiving, or they didn't conceive at all. They didn't have children, and it's interesting because he goes in the chart and he studies the part of children. The part of children is there in both. And they're just in one page, one is in the front and the other was in the verso, the recto and the verso of the same folio. And husband and wife, and he's studying the part of children. And it's known historically that they had problems having an heir. And there it is, he is studying that at the time they are alive. And it's possible that he is one of their advisors.
Okay.
Because he has a lot of detail on those people, because he was accompanying the life of those people as he was going. So probably he was one of their physicians, something. We don't know the details, but that's very interesting to know this and to have all this details about a colleague from far, far in the past,
Right. And there's one, actually, you mentioned a physician, and that there's one tantalizing clue that Helena mentions, which is that there is one physician in France in the 15th century whose name was Simone Belle. And so there's the suspicion of whether, even though there's no direct evidence, there's at least a question of whether that could be the author of these two astrological texts.
Exactly. Probably it is, because there are not many names with S in that time period. Simon is a very high probability. So all historians agree that most likely this is Simon Belle, a physician, and he appears to have medical knowledge. So that points of him being a physician, surely. But again, you cannot say for sure that it is Simon Belle. You can only make that possibility. You raise that possibility. There's a strong possibility that this guy is called Simon Belle, but we really don't know for sure.
Right. So, and this is in a period where in the 15th century, many doctors had some astrological training for diagnostic purposes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, astrology and medicine are always connected, and there are a large group of physicians which are astrologers as well. And in France, you have a long history during the 15th century of astrologer physicians. And this is one of them, most certainly.
Okay.
Yeah, and one of the other interesting charts is an orrery that comes at the very end of the French manuscript, upside down. So he had the book upside down when he wrote it, and it's, what does it say? It's an orrery on the general fortune. It's a universal question.
Hmm.
What is going to be the fortune, destiny, of that person? And by the date, Helena thinks that it's one of his patrons who is involved in a political coup in which one of the leaders, is killed by the King of France. And so they're very afraid for their lives at this point. So possibly this is a time where he does this question, what is going to happen to me?
Wow.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah, so sometimes astrologers were dealing sometimes with the very serious matters of life and death.
Yeah.
Okay. In addition to medical things, and I think not too long after this time period, there was another doctor, was Jerome Cardan also trained in medicine?
Yes.
Okay.
Cardan was a physician. More than he was a mathematical doctor, so a doctor of medicine and an astrologer.
Right. Or even actually Nostradamus was also trained in medicine, a doctor as well as an astrologer.
Yeah. A lot of the astrologers, the well-known astrologers, are court physicians. So usually, not all of them, but usually when you say, oh, he was the court astrologer, that means he was the court physician and he knew astrology. And that's why sometimes they have good information on the birth of princes, because they are there for the delivery. So they know when it happened, what time it happened, Right. They're on top of it.
That's a really good reference point, maybe, for people not familiar with the time period, but just that Nostradamus would have been born a few decades after and would have lived a few decades after Belle.
Yeah. It's the next century. Yeah.
Right.
So by the time Nostradamus is born, Belle would be in his old age, if he's still alive. We don't know exactly his age. We estimate, but we don't know. We don't have his birth data, unfortunately. It's rare to have the astrologer's own birth data in this period, although there are these instances, where they repeat a certain chart that leads historians to suspect, this probably is their own chart.
Yeah. The one with the Valens is funny because he knows a little bit too much about this one person's life, including that the guy was involved in a shipwreck when he was 35 or 36, and that he happened to have the birth charts of like 8 other people that were on the same ship, which is a little suspicious.
It's suspicious, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. One of the things I think that Helena mentions in the book was that there was a little bit of like a generational shift in astrology around this time period as well, and there's a little bit of tension of he seems to be part of a tendency sometimes to value older sources like Ptolemy that he thought were, more tied in with, were older or more authoritative in some way, even though he also draws on the medieval Arabic tradition.
Yeah. Here, and this is something that she noticed early on, and it's very important. Is we are seeing that that what we call today the return to Ptolemy, that shift into the more Ptolemaic approach that we then will characterize the 16th and the 17th century.
The back to Ptolemy movement.
Yeah. And that's a very interesting line of work, because we see a lot of evolutions on that. And within that movement, later on in the 17th century, we see a return to tradition, where they're rejecting a lot of what Ptolemy said and going back to the Arabs. And there's a lot of that. That's a very interesting line in itself to study. But here, what we observe is that he gives Ptolemaic terms in the table. So he has one of those standard tables of dignities where he has Ptolemaic terms, but then at the end of the table he has the sum of the almutants. So adding all the dignities, what almutant, which planet has the most dignities in which degree, and those calculations are not made according to the Ptolemaic terms that he's putting in the table, but with Egyptian terms. So he's mixing systems there, and you see them also in the practice, sometimes using Ptolemaic terms and sometimes using Egyptian terms. So he's, in between two systems. Again, in the part of fortune, in certain charts, you can see the part of fortune and then the part of fortune according to Ptolemy. So he doesn't know, or sometimes other parts, one normal and the other one according to Ptolemy. So they already, at this period, he doesn't know should he invert the formula or not. Because if Ptolemy is not doing it for the part of fortune, should they invert it for the other parts as well? So you see, this coming in and this debate coming in. Should you use the ingress chart or should you use the previous lunation? And there's a whole debate which one is more correct. And the Ptolemically inclined astrologers tend to use the lunation, the previous lunation. Other astrologers would use the chart of the ingress itself. So there is this debate going on. We don't see him debating because he doesn't write text of his own. But we can see that it's in its practice, the doubt or the experimentation exists in the charts themselves, which is fabulous. It's absolutely fabulous.
Right, because you can see the tension in the practice and what he's actually doing between those two different streams of the tradition, and it was something that becomes much more openly sort of debated in subsequent centuries, like in the 17th century with Lilly and some of his decisions of when to incorporate Ptolemy versus when to go with other astrologers, and a tendency to favor Ptolemy in issues of disputes. But it's interesting seeing that tension, because for this author, for S. Belle, he would have been inheriting, on the one hand, knowing that Ptolemy was the oldest text that survived to him at that time, but that its approach to astrology is a bit different compared to the tradition of astrology that was inherited from the Arabic stream and the early Latin stream, which in terms of some of its procedures was much different because it was more influenced by Dorotheus and the Dorothean stream of the tradition. It kind of makes me think of, when I think about this issue in the astrological community, it makes me think of the difference between, there's some historian who said, or maybe it was like Nick Campion or somebody that said that, all philosophy, Western philosophy, is basically just Plato or Aristotle for many centuries, and different people playing off of either the Platonic stream or the Aristotelian stream for like 1,000 years or 2,000 years. It's kind of similar here in the astrological tradition, where for a very long time you have the Ptolemaic stream and the sort of Dorothean stream playing off in some ways and being passed down in the tradition, and then this fundamental tension between the two of them.
Yeah, exactly. And you see that going on because Ptolemy is a very incomplete and unclear source. If we look at it, it's a very interesting book. I think anyone interested in astrology should at least, have a copy of Ptolemy and just read it a little bit to know our own origins, as Dora tells. These are the two main sources that build the whole tree of tradition. But Ptolemy, the Tetrabill is a very incomplete book. And Ptolemy is confusing in the way he explains things, He goes about them in a very strange way. And houses is one of the main problems with Ptolemy. He doesn't give a listing, the normal listing of the houses and the meanings of the houses and the use of the houses, as we see in the Dorothean tradition. So you cannot rely on Ptolemy to practice astrology. You would have a very, very incomplete way of looking at things. So you need to meet there, to make it more consistent, and that's what we see throughout. And the astrologers recognize this. The good ones, the ones that are really well educated in their sources, they know the limitations of Ptolemy. What they do is, because Ptolemy describes things in such a coherent philosophical Aristotelian system, of natural philosophy. He tries to structure astrology within the concepts of natural philosophy. He's a go-to source for explanations, but not a go-to source if you really want to practice astrology, because he's not going to give you the things you need. It doesn't have the basic tools for chart interpretation, for elections, for orrery, for mundane. It's incomplete. You need other ones, and then this problem, you can see it throughout history, from early on, to the Arabs, to the Latin world, and then to this period, and later on, also in the 16th and 17th century. And it's a very interesting development. It's the debate or the dilemma that is transversal historically from any tradition that you're studying.
Right. So, and this is one of the earliest and best instances of seeing that tension in an astrologer's own internal, dialogue or monologue with himself, with, as you said, putting both positions in the same chart and sort of maybe then in some sense experimenting or trying out different ones to see what worked best in practice.
Yeah, exactly. And that is the value of these charts, because we're seeing they are experiment. It's not just a theoretical debate that it's done in books and text. It's something that they are experimenting in practice and trying to figure out which one works better. And this is the prelude of that return to Ptolemy and the rejection of the Arabs, which is more typical of very late 15th century, by the end of the last decade of the 15th century and early decades of the 16th century. That's where all of that is really coming onto public debate, in printed books, with of course the famous disputationes of Pico della Mirandola being, a catalyzer for that debate. But it's already going on decades before his work.
Right. So, so Helena took it on herself to become the world expert on this book and on researching everything possible and becoming an authority, not just on this text, but also all of the sources surrounding it and the time period surrounding it and everything else. And that's what she spent the greater part of that last decade of her life focusing on. And eventually she successfully defended her PhD thesis at the end of, you said 2018?
2018, yeah.
Okay. What was that like? Or can you describe for those that don't know what it's like to defend a PhD thesis? What that's like, or what that might have been like for her?
Yeah, well, the process is you have to write it down. And it varies a little bit from country to country, but in her case, she submitted the final document after being approved by, of course, Charles Burnett, which is the supervisor. After all things were corrected and everything was okay, she was submitted, and then she has to go through a viva, so an evaluation, in which you have, in which are present the supervisor, which cannot intervene, two outside evaluators, and then a neutral party, that it's only there to assure that everything is going to occur with the correct proceedings. And so what happens is these two evaluators have read your thesis, have read your arguments, and are going to ask you questions, or making comments on your argument. Is your argumentation correct? Have you forgotten something crucial? Is the argumentation well done? So they're going to ask questions to see if you really know you can defend your position and your own arguments. And that's the process. Once that is done satisfactorily, several things can happen. You can pass without any corrections being done to the document. That would be the top, or you can pass with suggestions for correction before the final submission, or they might fail you. It's very rare that you reach this this point and they fail you, because for someone to fail a PhD or have to completely rewrite it happens. That means it's not a good job, and it means that the supervisor didn't do his work, because a supervisor has to be the one who says, okay, now it's good enough to be evaluated. If it's not, you just get it back, write it again.
Nobody goes into the defending it, for the most part, not being prepared or ready to defend it. It's only once you're fully ready and you've written everything exhaustively that you go into this process.
Yeah, exactly. If it's properly done, because it can happen that people fail. It's rare nowadays, but it does happen, unfortunately. And that's not only the student to blame, but also the supervisor that didn't do his job. And most other times they suggest corrections, It can be minor things. In Helena's case, it was minor things, and then submission.
So it looks like because it was defended in the UK, I think all of the PhD theses are available publicly online, and somebody had sent me the link. Is it okay if I show that? Is that true?
Yeah, it's public.
Okay, just making sure. So here is there's the actual thesis, which is titled The Making of an Astrologer in 15th-century France, the Notebooks of S. Belle, Lisbon, MS 1711, and Paris, NAL 398, and University of London, Warburg Institute 2018. Dissertation submitted in fulfillment of the requirement of the degree of Doctor of Philosophy on Combined Historical Studies. Supervisors Charles Burnett and Sarah Migliletti. And there's her signature on April 12th, 2018. So, and then it's just this super comprehensive treatment.
No, sorry, not April 12th. It's the 4th of December.
Yeah, sorry about that.
It's European
backwards.
style,
Yeah, sorry. So 12th, thank you for pointing that out. So 4th of December, 2018.
Yeah.
And then super comprehensive table of contents for just every aspect of these two documents and everything that is known or could possibly be known, and all of the cross-referencing of all other historical sources that are relevant in understanding this document, so that she became the world-leading expert on these two documents and the surviving works of this astrologer from the 15th century.
Yeah, and it is it's a very, very good work she did. There aren't a lot of academic works on the practices and the techniques of astrology, and hers, I think, to date is one of the largest, because she's really looking at it from the point of view of practice, of the astrological doctrine he's using. It's very technical. We sometimes compared it, and I still do, to the history of mathematics. If you want to study how, let's say, logarithms were discovered and applied in a document, you really have to outline the mathematical doctrine of logarithms, how are they used, examples of their usage, etc. The same thing with astrology. And that's a very technical book, and it's a very expert book, Not all historians are going to read a book on the history of logarithms. And as the same, not all historians will be interested in the history of the astrological techniques, but still, it's a very important work to be done. And I think she does it very well here. It's a good example to follow, let's say.
Yeah, it's a major contribution to our understanding of the history of astrology and just history in general. So once she defended her thesis in late 2018 and she was awarded the degree, doctorate, she then edited the dissertation and turned it into a book, which just came out this year. It came out, I think, in July of 2021, right?
Yeah, she submitted the book in around this time. Then in 2020, then it was reevaluated. You had the peer reviewing process that goes always with this academic publications. Then she made the adjustments and the requirements that the peer review were asking. And then she did the final version and she had submitted it. She saw the cover, I think, 1 week before she passed away.
Wow.
Yeah. And the proofs arrived 1 week after.
So you received the proof copy just a week after she passed away unexpectedly, and that was her work was finally out there and sort of completed in that way. What were the changes that she made in between, like the dissertation versus the book?
I think she transcribes more of the manuscript, and she consolidates a little bit more some of the argumentation, and she cleans up a little bit more of the structure of the book, from the thesis to the book, because there is a difference between a thesis and a book. So there is an adjustment that needs to be done. And that's what she's done. You can find the main argumentation on the thesis online. It's there. It's just better aligned and polished in the book format. It's a more mature version of the PhD. And took her 1 year and a half to do this. The structuring, correcting errors that passed, unnoticed, stuff like that. It's adjusting and restructuring. I can't tell you the whole difference because at that point I was completing my own PhD, so I wasn't on top of what she was doing at the time. But what you have in the book is a polished version of the historical argumentation of the thesis.
Okay. So here it is. So it's published by Brill, which is basically the main academic publisher of works on the history of astrology. And it says the publication date was either June or July of 2021.
Yeah. It shifted around a little bit, but it was in July, in June.
Okay.
Because you have the online the PDF comes a little later, I think, than the printed version.
Okay, so the print version is the one that's dated 10th of June 2021, and that's the earlier one.
That's the earlier one. Yeah.
So you received the manuscript for the book a week after she passed away, and she did get to see at least the cover, which is pretty amazing. Then you had to put together the index because it wasn't quite finished yet, right?
Yeah. Charles Burnett made most of the English revision, and he wrote and the adjustments, because he's the native speaker. I'm not an English native speaker, so some of the obvious things I will miss. So he did that, and was a lot of work that he had on that. And I corrected anything to do with tables, and mistakes in the graphics, and also composed the index once we had the final version. And I did the index, and Helena had already left a lot of instructions, how to do the index, because she had been thinking about it. So she had compiled a list of terms that she thought the index should have. And what I did, I picked those terms, and there are several indexes, but it's the index of astrological terms and concepts, which is on page 416. That I did. It was it took me a week to do. And I tried to do it. If you are a historian of astrology or someone interested in the history of astrology, and you want to find a certain term, a certain concept, the index is built to make your life easier.
Right.
And I try to do, I try to think in this, if I was looking for astrological terminology and concepts in the book, how would I like it to be laid out? So I did my best. It was very difficult for me at the time to do this, because I had to do this weeks after she had died, and I could work, half an hour on the book, and then I would have to stop.
Right. Yeah. I mean, to what extent? Because it was something that happened suddenly and unexpectedly, was not something that was anticipated. To what extent was that something that helped you to get through it, or to what extent was that useful in terms of the grieving process, being able to bring her work to completion for her?
Well, it helps, it honors her memory. This is her legacy, and I want it to be as perfect as I could make it and contribute to that. So I didn't want to wait. So I wanted to work on this immediately, so that the book was published on time. No delays at all, because this was very important to her. So I make sure that this was done quickly and in time.
Yeah, and you were able to mention it in the introduction to update some of that quickly, which is good. And so publishing the book was one of the last major things that she did. But I noticed that after she completed her PhD thesis, the two of you also launched the Astra project, right? There was other long-term plans that both of you set in motion pretty quickly over the past couple of years. And I should actually mention before I get into that, in the past few months also successfully defended your own PhD thesis.
Yeah. I submitted it on the week before she died, and I defended it on the 28th of June.
Okay. So that was just a few weeks after her book came out. And
well, I received the copies, the first copies of her book, in the exact day that I defended my thesis. I had just defended my thesis in the morning, and the books came afterwards,
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Sometimes things happen like that. I don't know if that felt a little reassuring, or how did you feel about that?
Well, it's meaningful for me, two major things are accomplished in a single day, Finally, I have the physical, book. It's the final step in the process, and it's the same time that I'm completing a huge step for me in terms of my own work, and also the accomplishment of the last 4 years of my life around my own work, and all of that coming together.
What was the title of your thesis?
Let's see if I can remember it. It's Transgressing Boundaries. It's Jesuit astrology, Jesuit astrology in Portugal. So what I'm studying there is the use and teaching of astrology by the Jesuit order in the early modern period.
Okay, and so it's more like 16th, 17th century?
Yeah, 16th, 17th century. So a little later.
Right. So with that, both of you completed that sort of journey into academia that you had both started about a decade or more earlier.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the peak, the accomplishment of the PhD. It's your peak in your progress of studies is when you complete, and now you've become officially an expert, or at least someone who has the proper credentials to research the topic properly, academically. And that's a high point. This would be her high point. It became her legacy. It's a pity. It's sad, but well.
Well, it's a major contribution, and it's great that she was able to finish it and make that contribution, because then it's not only that sort of academic side of her work that she was able to bring to completion, in addition to all of the astrological work and the practical work that she had done in teaching, hundreds or thousands of astrologers and influencing, but also setting a standard and showing the way for many astrologers for many generations in the futures of what you can actually accomplish through dedication and skill and, hard work.
Yeah, exactly. And also she would say by respecting astrology, recognizing astrology by what it is and what it has to offer, and not by your own standards, not fitting astrology in your own limited perspective, but expanding your perspective to encompass a much larger thing than you can ever perceive.
So for her, it was about rising to the occasion in order to raise your own standards in order to meet up to what you need to be in order to do it right for the sake of the astrology and for respecting it.
Yeah, exactly. She had this huge respect for astrology, and she said that above all, astrology should be respected. It's to astrology that she owed her, her life passion and one of her main life passions. And she would always respect astrology and try to make it, clean, clear knowledge, both from the practical point of view and the academic study of astrology, the historical study of astrology.
Right. And one of the things that you two started working on in the last couple of years was this project for the academic study of astrology and for recognizing the contributions of different scholars, both in the present as well as in the past, that had made major contributions to that. And this was the Astra project, which is academic conversations on the history of astrology.
Yeah, well, that's the podcast. That's our, let's say, that's the public face of the Astra project. What the Astra project was, it was an idea or the project that appeared by the time that Charles Burnett launched the Al-Bumashar Greater Introduction. And there was this huge conference. We did a pre-conference workshop in explaining the fundamentals of traditional astrology, in a sense that what would you need to understand in terms of techniques and the doctrine to understand and to be able to read properly the Great Introduction. So we were giving a sort of a workshop on basic astrology for academics. And that was quite an experience. And that was the official time where the Astra project came into being. And it was very good because we had the chance to invite in person a lot of the academics that were there to join and to participate as advisors to the project. And Helena had this very good skill of connecting people and talking to people. And so one of her great contributions to the project was to establish a network, and we have a lot of advisors. We have a lot of people connected to the Astro project at this point. And we had this huge conference planned 2 years ago, but then COVID came and that was not possible to do. And I hope by next year I am able to accomplish that. And in August, then because the conference was not happening, we decided, and everyone was at home, locked in. We decided to launch the Ad Astra podcast, in which we made these conversations. Well, they're not really interviews, it's conversations, casual conversations on the history of astrology with these academics or researchers that are doing their work in this field. And we gathered quite a good collection of videos this past year. And now after Helena passed away, there it is. After Helena passed away, it stopped. I stopped, of course. I still published a few videos that I had on archive to be published, which still feature her. And now I regain again the momentum. So there's a huge. So if you want to hear about, for those listening to this podcast, if you want to hear the researchers speaking about their work and their research in their own words, that's the place to go.
Yeah, so it's at youtube.com/the Astra Project, and I'll put a link to it either below this video on YouTube or on the Astrology Podcast website page for this episode for those that are listening to the audio version. But it's just this amazing collection where you're going through and you've been interviewing or having these dialogues with some of the leading historians on the history of astrology at this point. And also one of the things that it has shown is just the scope of areas that these historians are working on in different ways, in terms of ways that astrology can be studied within the context of history.
Yeah, exactly. The project itself, it's very focused on the history of astrological techniques. So the research project implies to study how the techniques developed throughout time. So it's very specific. But with the podcast, we opened up a little bit more. So we're also talking with people who are doing research, historical research of astrology, on topics which are not technical. It can be philosophical, it can be social, it can be several times, several periods of time, some outside the scope of the original Astro project, but still, which are interesting to know, the whole universe of research that is out there. And I hope to continue to do this at least once a month. I would like to launch an episode where I talk with one of these researchers and present what they're doing, how they got there. And I'll be also organizing, and this is the first time I'm going to announce this publicly, a workshop on the history of astrology and the dilemmas of the discipline of the history of astrology academically with some of these scholars, which is now. It would be, if everything goes well, in the 6th of November, and this will be an online event. And I should have those details soon. And of course, people can attend. I'm not sure if directly via Zoom, like in a big conference, or in a YouTube broadcast, but it will be available publicly.
Nice. That's amazing. That sounds great.
And this, I hope, it will be a prelude to a big in-person conference to happen sometime in mid 2022. So let's see if all goes well.
Yeah, I know the last one had an amazing lineup, and that was scheduled for April or May of 2020 originally, right? But it then COVID happened in March and April, and you had to cancel it. But I think you've been able to show with the Astra project and with those conversations, just, how much interest there is and how just the sheer amount of work that is being done on the history of astrology by different scholars around the world. So there's a need for that and a need for those conversations. And, there's probably people listening to this podcast now that didn't know that they could get a degree or get a PhD or a master's thesis focusing on the history of astrology, but that might be interested in that. And so this maybe will give some people some different ideas or some insight into that process. I mean, having completed that yourself over the past decade and doing this work with Helena, what would you recommend to people if they did want to either go to school or if they're currently in school and wanted to focus on that area, or if they wanted to go back to school like the two of you did? I mean, do you have any advice, or is that something that is doable, that is possible?
Yes, it is. I always say to people, it's never late to go back to school and do what degree you want. It depends on the scope of your objective. You do have you can do an MA if you don't have one, and I always do recommend if you really like research and you really want to contribute with your research, try to do it in an academic degree, because it will validate your work. It will give substance and consistency to your work. That doesn't mean that you already have, but it does give, because even if you're a good researcher, with the academic process, you learn the troubles and the lights of peer review, in which you have someone evaluating you and said, this argument is not consistent. You need to work on this, or you need to prove this. You need to do, and this is very important, because unfortunately, for those who like astrology nowadays doesn't have peer review at all. Almost anything is accepted, and tolerated, and people don't really put others into, I wouldn't say judgment, but evaluate their work, not judging people, but the work. And this is a facet that needs to be done. Otherwise, anything goes. And with the process of academia, at least you have that process of learning how to research and how to give a good foundation to your argument and to your conclusions. That's very important. So, if you have a degree, you can do an MA. And depending on what approach you want to do to astrology, you can go by any historical subject. History of culture, for example, is a huge area where astrology has a good place to be explored. You have the history of science, which is my area, in which I am exploring from the point of view as a scientific knowledge. Of its own time, of course. But you can go to social studies. You can go, if you want to work on, for example, the history of astrology in either today's world or from the 18th century or onwards, the history of science will not be the area, because it's no longer science by that period, but history of culture, social history, that can be literature. That can be an area where you can do an MA or a PhD. It really depends on the focus of your research. And then, those who want to do the more ancient areas, they would need language skills, paleography skills, and that's a whole learning curve that you need to do this work. But you can always find it, and why not?
Yeah, and it's never too late. I know in one of my early biographical interviews with Dimitra, she went back in the 1990s and to get a master's degree in classics, and that required her learning ancient Greek and learning Latin, which was not easy, but it was something that she was able to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, you could use your own skills, For example, we have tons of Arabic documents on astrology. that need to be researched. For example, this enormous collection that Helena explored. Who knows if we don't have an Arabic document with even more charts? If you already know Arab, if it's your language, why not attempt to explore this avenue? It's a must needed. There's a lot of answers to be found in Arabic manuscripts, being the medieval or even early modern. There's very little about early modern Arabic practice of astrology. You have so many examples. So explore your own country's history of astrology. Why not? And do a good work researching who were the astrologers, what they practiced, what they published. And you can do that even in the modern period, early 20th century, late 19th century. That's a very good era to explore. There are lots of things to be done. So
part of the point is, even though there's maybe more scholars doing work on the history of astrology than ever before, there's also still a huge amount of work that needs to be done. And so there's plenty of work and plenty of areas that different people could specialize in and set up entire careers studying that could, take up their focus for the rest of their life.
Exactly. And do a good contribution. You just need to make sure that, you're in the right place in terms of academia, and that you're doing a good work. And doing a good work has to do with your own inherent skills, of course, but you can also learn how to do that. You learn how to research. No one was born, knowing these things. You learn how to research. That's why MAs have orientation classes to teach you how to do the proper research, how to handle sources, how to make quotations, how to read other people's work so that you can sustain through their arguments your own argument. There's a whole process that people can engage in and learn. Yeah, why not? If you like to study, sure, go ahead. We need good work.
Right. So let's see. So you did the Astro project. I know Helena had other academic papers that were in the works, or that she finished. One of them was just published a few days ago, or just came out a few days ago, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's her last paper. There are one more that it will be published at some point. That's done. That's been done for years. But sometimes publications delay. That is a very simple paper, but interesting paper that I did with her and another colleague that should come up at any time, probably next year. But this last one was her last paper. It was the result of her stay in the Erlangen University in Germany for a postdoctoral position in the IKGF, which studies prognostication in Western and Eastern medieval environments. So they study a lot of divinatory arts, divinatory practices. So her proposal for them was to study how the ideas of longevity and calculating of the length of life would change throughout time. And there was a reflection between the philosophical approach and the practice. There was some kind of correlation. And she was exploring that. So it was a paper that it was still being explored. And she had submitted by the time she died for peer review, but the results came several weeks after she had passed away. And I have to thank Dorian Greenbaum, who helped me a lot in the revising of the paper, because she's more familiar with Greek and Hellenistic sources than I am, and she was able to make sure that all the citations were properly done and everything was as the best as it could be. There were certain improvements that could have been made to that paper, but Helena would have to have done that. If we had added a few things, it wouldn't be her paper. It would be ours. So we decided very early on, just to make the necessary corrections and leave the paper as is.
Yeah, that was probably a good approach to take. So it's published in the International Journal of Divination and Prognostication, which is another Brill publication. But the title of the paper is Who Wants to Live Forever? Astrological Methods for Calculating Lifespan in Western Culture and Perspectives on Determinism in Astrology.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, that's another really weird but sort of meaningful thing in terms of that being her final paper. And I was reading it yesterday and today, and it's literally a comprehensive part of it is a comprehensive overview of the traditional technique for determining the length of life that astrologers used for like 2,000 years.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, and she compared that with how that changed and how views of it changed in different eras based on changing philosophical trends and how sometimes astrologers' philosophies influenced how they used techniques.
Yeah, exactly. And because she saw it in Belle's work, and she has an example of Belle's there. There are several others in which she's calculating longevity, and there are ones which are very touching in which he's calculating the longevity of his own children, and he's coming to the conclusion that there isn't a good sign that the child will survive. And this is at the time when infant mortality is very high. He's making all these attempts to assure that the child will live and that the chart has signs that the child will live. But you see clearly that he's reaching the limits of interpretation that the rules allow. And then very sadly, you see he's noting that the child died, a few weeks afterwards or something like that. And that's hands-on, testimony of an astrologer that is practicing on its own children and living, the desperation of possibly losing a child, just born, and sometimes he even goes off in strange tangents of the technique. He bends the technique a little bit towards the awkwardness to try to get a good, a benefic that would somehow save the day. But and then he cannot, and you see that he's not trusting his own his own judgment on that, and that's quite fascinating. And from that kind of testimony, she had this idea of making this project on exploring, how that is handled, because he has all other examples where he's making natal delineations on people, and he says, well, we have this longevity, but then we do not have aspects until much later on. There's no direction that is dangerous after the time of the helag. And then he says, but with also a good diet, a good life, a pious life can be extended. And this idea, in which you have a Christian approach to longevity, in which piety can extend your life and can change somehow fate or what is determined by the chart, she had this idea of making this research and seeing how having this overview of how this changes throughout time and with different cultures and different philosophical approaches. So it's in its way, it's a derivation of her PhD.
Right. What were Helena's own thoughts or views on things like fate and determinism, or the extent to which astrology indicates that things that she saw it or used it to find meaning in life?
It's difficult to reproduce exactly her thoughts, but she had this idea that, in which I agree, there's no absolute determinism nor absolute freedom. There's an equation of balance between the two things. So within certain parameters, which you cannot change, you can move around those and make choices freely through them. But there are things which apparently are determined. You are raised. We can give examples outside astrology. You are raised in a specific environment that's going to mold your own perception and views of the world, with certain parents in a certain gender, in certain social norms, religious norms, and all of that is going to affect you, and that somehow locks you into a system. But within that, you can move, you can make choices, you can change mind, you can go outside. So sort of within our own field of limitations, we can be free. And that is more or less her approach. There is an equation here of balance between how free you can be and how determined things are. And that's what I think this more or less approaches her personal view on the matter.
Did her views change during the course of her career as an astrologer, or were they largely consistent?
I think they were largely consistent, yeah.
So I guess as we're getting towards the end of this, one of the questions, I guess, was to what extent your focus was obviously still going to continue to be, and her focus was still going to continue to be on the academic study of the history of astrology. But to what extent were you also still teaching astrology or going to teach in terms of the astrological community or in terms of the practice? I know that when I had you on last 2 years ago, it was to talk about your follow-up book for a course that the two of you were teaching on astrology. And I know she had some classes that she was teaching online on specific topics on the practice of astrology, right?
Yeah. She, well, throughout our academic careers, and paths, we never stopped teaching astrology and practicing it. We have been studying and teaching, and practicing all this time. We never stopped. We focused a lot of Portugal. We didn't go outside Portugal too much, but we have been consistently teaching astrology for all these years. And in the last 3 years, we started to expand. So when more or less by the time we spoke, we started to expand that also to to outside of Portugal, so to teach in English, which is something that we hadn't done for quite a while. So now I have several courses running, and there are still courses by Helena. And thankfully, because of this online work with recordings, I have a lot of recordings of Helena's lessons, which are here as her legacy, and people can later on. I'm going to reorganize that and offer those as courses. If you still want to have an idea, have the experience of her teaching, you still can. She taught an advanced course, an introduction to the approach of the chart in a more advanced manner. She taught a whole course on chart comparison in relationship astrology, and a part of our course on our introductory course on astrology. So those lessons will be here for some time, and I'll keep them alive in the next year, so people can experience Helena even after she was gone, because she had a very special way of teaching astrology, and she was very passionate when she taught, and I think people should experience that and have the chance to see her.
Yeah, it's one of the things that's different in terms of comparing Belle's legacy of just having these two books survive versus having much more output of both Helena's academic and intellectual work as well as the practical work on astrology and the classes and the workshops that the two of you authored together.
Yeah, exactly.
What's the website for your school?
It's academyofastrology.eu.
Okay.
That's the English site. Then there's also the Portuguese site, which is academiadeastrologia.com.
Yeah, and here's the website just for those looking for it, academyofastrology.eu. Yeah. What else, as we're thinking about this, were other things that you wanted to say or that we should talk about as we wrap up about just her legacy and what her contributions were in the end, both in terms of academics as well as in terms of the practice of astrology? I mean, you're at a point in your career where it's somewhat nice that you can see the influence, and she got to see some of the influence that she had on the astrological tradition, although I kind of suspect that might just be the sort of tip of the iceberg, so to speak, that we've seen pieces of over the past half a decade or decade or so, but that going forward, that might end up becoming even larger than we can tell now in some ways.
Yeah. Well, what can we say to sort of wrap up our conversation? Well, Helena was a very strong person. She had a very acute intellect, and she was able to perceive people and people's dynamics very easily. And she was an excellent counselor. She was not only a good astrologer in the sense, a good interpreter of charts, but she was also very good at counseling and transforming the astrology and the astrological interpretation in something that could be useful for the person who was in front of her. And she was very good at that. Very good at that, yeah.
So that was important to her. That was a core piece of her practice of astrology, is that counseling dynamic.
Yeah, and the way that you transmit the astrological information to the other person, and to be aware of how to do it. And that was something that was always on her mind when she was teaching, not just teach the doctrine, but also how you're going to say that to someone who doesn't know astrology and just searches for advice. Yeah.
Was it meant to be useful? Was that the goal in terms of astrology for her, at least when it came to clients, or what did she hope that they could get out of it? And also in terms of her presentation of it, I know Zoller, for example, your first teacher with traditional, that his bedside manner, as they call it, was legendarily direct and kind of brusque, and he did not pull any punches, so to speak, when it comes to delineating a person's chart and sometimes saying things that could be either off-putting or just very stark when it came to interpreting the chart in the old way. How did she deal with that when it came to the consulting setting?
She wouldn't hide anything from you. She would not avoid talking about your problems and your defects and things that you were doing wrong and wrong choices and things that were incorrect. She was very straightforward with that. But she was an ancient time, and she would put you against the wall if you were doing something that didn't make sense. But at the same time, she was very caring in doing that. So she wouldn't be blunt, she would be forceful, she would be direct, but not menacing or doing that in sort of a abrupt way, That was not her object. Her purpose was that the person would get out of the consultation with a good reflection of what was happening, being behavior or an event that was happening at the point, and having tools to really work that out in her own life. She was not into that very you are like this and this is going to happen and things like that. That was not her approach to tradition at all, as it's not mine. I think people sometimes mistake that to be a good traditional astrologer, you have to be very harsh. That's a bit Zolar's point of view. We have to straight things straightforward, have that map of person's life. Well, that might work for, medieval age or for early modern, but nowadays you're in a different cultural setting, so you're not going to give that kind of deterministic or very rigid line of interpretation, and if there's something that I've learned to my all years as an astrologer is that you can learn, the tradition has very good tools to make a psychological analysis of a person. Very accurate, and that was our approach. That was something that we developed very early on, and to which Helena had a very keen eye. She could immediately see the configurations, and she would very well translate that into behavior and habits and mechanisms that the person would have.
To what extent was some of that maybe some good pieces that you took from your earlier, or that she took from her earlier career in modern astrology?
Perhaps she didn't base her in modern astrology. She was always very concerned with counseling. I think that in another universe she would be a very good psychologist. She could have been a very good psychologist without astrology, even so, because she would be able to understand people very well and to perceive how people worked very well. And that could have been a career for her, but she didn't want that. And I don't know if she got that from modern astrology. I think that she got that from her own perception of things. And then she used tradition to enhance, because I remember her saying that a lot of times that the tradition was giving substance to her delineations and to her ability to interpret and help people. And it was giving her consistently tools that worked and that would give valuable information. So I think we have a counseling, so a more modern counseling with traditional astrology, which is something people don't think that could exist, but it does.
Were there ever any major instances where the two of you disagreed on something about astrology and later she turned out to be right, that you can think of that are like notable instances of differences in technique or approach or observations or like initial theories that sometimes, especially early in one's studies, somebody has, or an idea that somebody has that maybe one of you goes in one direction and the other isn't sure about that, but then things work out in a certain way?
Well, I can't recall any instances like that. I think we dialogued a lot, so we were always discussing things and learning together. We did all of this together always, and talking with each other, in our views and debating and trying to understand. Sometimes she had very good insights. Sometimes I had good insights for her. So it was kind of a half-half thing. Although we did have our own approach. We don't do the same approach. My approach is different than hers is. I'm perhaps a bit more technical in certain aspects, and she was more technical in another aspect. But
I guess one of them that you mentioned earlier was, just in terms of differences, was that you ended up focusing more on natal and going the natal route with Zolar's material, whereas she ended up getting more into horary with Sue Ward's material at one point.
Yeah, at one point we did do that because we couldn't be studying the whole thing at the same time. But for example, I ended up doing horary consultations. Helena didn't. she didn't like to do that alone. She would use orrery always in the context of a regular consultation. She would never do it by itself.
And she didn't like to share her details of her birth data or her birth chart, right?
No, she didn't. She didn't.
What were her reasons for that?
Well, she didn't want. It's private. No, the chart is private, and I share that view with her. The chart is private, and I think also we were fed up with people talking about their charts, and learning astrology only by their charts, and their charts being the measure of everything. And so early on, we stopped telling people our charts, and also not putting people's charts into the class context. That's something I avoid altogether. I always say to my students, well, if you want to ask something about your chart, be clever about it. Ask about the configuration. Don't, my chart has this. Don't ask me that. I'm not going to answer that.
Right. Yeah. That's a good tip for, I think, any new students of astrology, that if you're going to go that route, at the very least, it should be of a very specific thing. Although then sometimes that can not work because it'll be overly specific of, five.
You can always have the chart of a friend. I've seen this chart that has this configuration.
Okay. Yeah.
Because people, when they study astrology, they tend to be very obsessive about their charts. Some more than others. And at some point, we let go of your chart. You won't learn with your chart. You learn with other people's charts. Of course, if you're learning something, you're always going to see it in your chart. More than natural that you do it, but you don't have to show it, around to everyone. I don't like that. Or justify your choices, your likings or dislikings by your chart. Sometimes it gets too much.
Right, like house division or rulerships or any of the other debates that happen in astrology.
Yeah, not really that. I mean, what I mean is people saying, "Oh, I don't know. I'm going to make something up. I like cakes a lot and I eat a lot because I have Venus wherever, and I'm like this because I have whatever trine whatever or square whatever." Don't do that. You can do that occasionally in an astrological conversation, but people do it all the time, constantly, and students emulate that. And at the same, and they're always talking about their charts. I have seen people that do synastry, extensive synastry with their clients before a consultation. Come on, get over it. Forget your chart. It's the other person's chart that you need to be dealing with, not your own. And it's not about you, and it can be excessive. And that's one of the points. And also, for example, when you're teaching, if the students know your chart, they tend to judge that you're saying certain things about certain planetary positions or certain planets because you have them in your own chart. So it's better to be as neutral as one can be about these things. Yeah.
Sure, that makes sense. All right, and yeah, and in terms of what ended up happening, it was just unexpected, but it wasn't otherwise something that you wanted to go into, and so that's one of the reasons why we've deliberately, not for the purpose of this, but I just wanted to say that in order to avoid questions about those two topics of one, the birth data, and two, the other details.
Yeah, sure. What I can say about her death is that it was sudden, unexpected, a condition that suddenly popped up and it was fatal. And I can clarify it was not COVID related, because indeed it came at a time when I had to say this to people. It hadn't to do with the current pandemic, whatsoever. It was another thing. And it's one of those bombs that falls into your life, and
yeah. Has astrology, something I was talking to somebody, a listener of the show asked me at one point, recently who was struggling with grief, to what extent astrology has been helpful or not very helpful for you in terms of the grieving process. Because I know different astrologers deal with grief and cope with things in different ways, and different things may feel appropriate for one astrologer that are not appropriate to another, and maybe even the same astrologer might go through different phases in which some things feel appropriate or not appropriate. How has that been for you, not just as a person but as an astrologer?
Well, I won't go into personal details, and grief is something that it's very personal. It's very intimate. It changes with time. And if you're an astrologer and you have lived something like this, whatever explanation you might try to search, in charts or movements or whatever, in the end, you just have to go to the grieving process and live it, no matter what can explain it or not explaining it. So my advice in terms of as an astrologer is that don't get too obsessed in grief,
Sure.
and let things go their own way and exist as they have to.
Right.
And that will be different for each person.
Right. My last question is, what is your favorite memory of Helena from her life or from the experiences the two of you had together? What is the most notable things that stands out as like a good memory as you think back from the past 20 years?
That's a difficult one.
I mean, because it sounds like you had a lot of really great moments together, and you encountered a lot of amazing turning points in your life during the course of your time together, and were able to be there at such crucial turning points in each other's lives, and to help each other out in so many different ways.
Yeah, and all of that is good. It's difficult to... The being together was good. And excellent. The studying together and sharing all of this was good, to share my life with her. But perhaps I would say her smile, when facing all of this, and when living all of this.
Yeah, she had a great smile, and she had a great way of, like you said earlier, it seemed like she really cared with people. And when she had direct conversations with people, she was very present, and you could tell she was very present in every conversation that she had. And it's something that comes through in all of the conversations that the two of you recorded on the podcast, the Astro podcast together.
Yeah. And perhaps it's that joy she had that was there, it's her.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for doing this with me tonight and sitting down to talk about her life and work, and in order to remember her and to give other people some idea of what she accomplished with her life and everything that she did, and how hard she worked on this, and how much she lived up to the high bar, and set a high bar for every other astrologer and every other researcher who wants to either is or wants to get into this field.
Yeah, and that's something she probably would say, set your high bar and go for it, and follow it and try always to be the best you can. Be the greatest you can, be the best you can. Aim high. And do something that's noticeable, that's visible.
Right.
But do it good, do it properly, do it respecting astrology, respecting that which is guiding you, and that respect your passion.
Yeah, and that, which sometimes the work that we do and accomplish and carry out, sometimes carrying over even when we're not around, but then still having a lasting legacy and an echo of our lives for a long time afterwards, and sometimes paying that forward in the astrological tradition by recognizing other astrologers that came before us in the way that she did with her PhD thesis of this astrologer from the 15th century.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think perhaps if we had to name two, and this might be a bit, I don't want to leave anything out, but it will be this book of her PhD and Beyond the Heavenly Spheres would be, her two greatest achievements, one in astrology and one in the academic study of the history of astrology. I think those two are the high points, focal points of her work.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Well, here's the book, and it's an amazing accomplishment. So I hope people check it out. Either, the PhD thesis itself, which is available online and contains so much of the research and the core of the research, if they can't afford the book, or if you can get a copy of the book from Brill or to check one out from the library, then it's really worth checking out.
Yeah, it is.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for doing this. I'm glad that we were able to record this conversation and to talk about this. And just, I know a lot of people in the community, when the news first came out, were both really shocked and sad to hear of Helena's loss, and also wondering how you were doing, since you're another respected leader in the community and respected, and everyone appreciates your contributions. So I hope that's something, you know as well, and that if there's anything that you need or anything in terms of the community to support you, just let us know so that, you can keep producing your own work and other things in the future, which is very important.
Yeah. Well, the work will go on, and it's going on. And I'm here not only to continue our legacy, our work, and continue to be here for astrology, and to also to represent her as best as I can.
Good.
And thank you for the opportunity to present also her work to the astrological community. I have done that within the academic community in the past months. Her book is going to be presented here next month. Official, launch. Of course, it has been there, but there will be an official launch, which probably I'll tape. I'm not sure if I can transmit it for those who are interested in attending. But this was a good opportunity to also address her astrological facet, that she also had beyond her academic work. And she always respect that, and she always stand by it.
Yeah, it makes me think of how Mercury was the traditional ruler of astrology, and how it was always playing that role of bridging and bringing together those two opposite areas of everything in life. And she seems like almost the embodiment of that in some ways, in bridging those two worlds of astrologers in the academic community.
Yeah, indeed. And she had that ability to bridge people, groups. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for joining me, for having this discussion tonight.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here, and thank you for this time as well.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast. Be sure to check out the websites that I'll link to in the description below this video, or on the Astrology Podcast website, to check out the resources that we talked about in this episode. But otherwise, that's it. So thanks a lot for listening, and we'll see you again next time. Special thanks to all the patrons that supported the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, thanks to the patrons on our producers tier, including Nate Craddock, Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Sumo Kopic, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Morgan McKinsey, Kristen Otero, and Sanjay Srihari. If you like the work that I'm doing here on the podcast and you would like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. And in exchange, you'll get access to bonus content such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the month ahead forecast each month, access to a private monthly auspicious elections report that we put out each month, access to exclusive episodes that are only available for patrons, or you can also get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, go to patreon.com/astrologypodcast. The main software we use here on the podcast to look at astrological charts is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available at alabe.com, and you can use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we use a similar set of software by the same programming team called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is available from astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount on that as well. If you would like to learn more about the approach to astrology that I outline on the podcast, then you should check out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I traced the origins of Western astrology and reconstructed the original system that was developed about 2,000 years ago. And in this book, I outline basic concepts, but also take you into intermediate and advanced techniques for reading a birth chart, including some timing techniques. So you can find out more about the book at HellenisticAstrology.com/book. The book pairs very well with my online course on ancient astrology called the Hellenistic Astrology Course, which has over 100 hours of video lectures where I go into detail about teaching you how to read a birth chart and showing hundreds of example charts in order to really demonstrate how the techniques work in practice. So find out more information about that at theastrologyschool.com. And finally, special thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is available at mountainastrologer.com, the Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs, available at honeycomb.co, the Portland School of Astrology at portlandastrology.org, and the AstroGold Astrology app, which is available for iPhone and Android. You can find out more information about that at astrogold.io.